Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never thought I'd be typing this out, but after what happened last week, I need to share it with people who might understand. I've been processing it for days now, and honestly, I'm still shaken up. Last Thursday, I took my boys Jake, 12, and Ethan, 9, fishing at a beaver pond about 2 miles up from the Wood River trailhead in Wyoming. We've been going there for years. It's our special spot where the brook trout practically jump onto your hook. The boys love it, and I love watching them get excited about the outdoors like I did when I was their age. We arrived around 3 in the afternoon. The weather was perfect, sunny, but not too hot, with that fresh mountain air that makes you feel like your lungs are finally working properly. The boys were in great spirits, racing ahead of me on the trail while I lugged our gear. We set up at our usual spot on the western edge of the pond, where there's a nice flat area for us to sit. Jake caught the first fish within 10 minutes, a decent-sized brook trout that had him beaming with pride. Ethan followed not long after. It was turning out to be exactly the kind of afternoon I'd hoped for. Around 5:30, as the sun was starting to dip behind the tree line, the woods got quiet. I mean eerily quiet. If you've spent any time in the wilderness, you know that sudden silence usually means something's up. The birds stopped chirping, and even the insects seemed to go still. I remember looking up from baiting Ethan's hook and noticing it, but I didn't say anything to the boys. No need to spook them over what was probably just a deer or elk passing through. Then we heard it. It started as a low moan that quickly escalated into the most bone-chilling scream I've ever heard in my life. I've been hunting these woods for over 20 years. I've heard elk bugle, mountain lions scream, bears roar, but this was something entirely different. It was like two voices layered on top of each other, a deep, guttural bass with a higher-pitched wail over it. The sound echoed through the valley for a good 3 or 4 seconds, then stopped. Jake dropped his rod. "Dad, what was that?" His voice was barely a whisper. Before I could answer, it happened again. Same sound, same duration, coming from maybe a half-mile away in the dense forest to the north of us. Then a third time. Ethan was pressed against my side now, eyes wide. "Can we go home, Dad?" I tried to play it cool, but my heart was racing. "Yeah, buddy, I think we've caught enough for today." I started packing up our gear as quickly as I could while trying to appear calm. Whatever made that sound, I didn't want to stick around to meet it. The walk back to the truck was tense. The boys stayed right beside me the whole way, no running ahead like usual. I kept scanning the tree line, my hand instinctively hovering near the knife on my belt. Not that it would do much good against whatever could make a sound like that. That night at home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. After the boys went to bed, I poured myself a whiskey and called my dad. He still lives in the same house I grew up in, about 40 miles from where we were fishing. "Dad, we heard something weird up at Wood River today," I said after some small talk. "What kind of weird?" He sounded immediately interested. When I described the scream, there was a long pause on the line. "Your mother and I heard something like that back in '90, he finally said. "We were staying at Uncle Bill's cabin up that way, but that's not all we heard." He went on to tell me something I'd never heard before. Apparently, they'd seen something too, a large black figure standing upright next to the cabin. Dad said its head was level with the porch awning, which would put it at around 8 feet tall. When they approached it, the thing ran uphill on 2 legs. The next morning, they found tracks in the mud, 18 inches long with what looked like human toes. Dad had never told me this story before. Said Mom made him promise not to scare me and my sisters with nonsense, but he seemed relieved to finally tell someone. "You remember your cousin Rick's story about his RV getting rocked at night up there in '91? Dad asked. I did remember. Rick had been camping alone in his little trailer when something started violently shaking it in the middle of the night. He was too terrified to look outside. In the morning, a box of apples he'd left on his picnic table was gone. We all teased him about it being a bear, but Rick always insisted bears don't just disappear without a trace or other signs. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about those screams and what Dad had told me. I decided I needed to go back, alone this time. I needed to see if there was any evidence of whatever made that sound. I told my wife I was going to check some hunting spots for the upcoming season. She knows how I get when I'm fixated on something and didn't question it too much. I left at dawn the next morning, Saturday. The forest felt different when I arrived. Maybe it was because I was alone, or maybe it was the knowledge of what might be out there. But everything seemed more threatening somehow. I parked at the same spot as before, but instead of heading to the pond, I went north, in the direction the screams had come from. The terrain gets steep quickly as you move away from the river. The pine forest is dense, with patches of aspen groves breaking it up. After about 40 minutes of hiking uphill, I came to a small clearing with a stream running through it. The ground near the water was soft and muddy. That's where I saw them, footprints, big ones. My first thought was bear, but these weren't bear tracks. They were elongated, roughly 16 inches long, with what clearly looked like 5 toes. They were deeper at the heel, suggesting whatever made them walked upright, putting weight on the back of the foot first, like humans do. I've tracked every animal in these mountains at some point in my life. These prints didn't belong to any animal I recognized. The stride length between them was huge, at least 4 feet apart. I took photos with my phone using my hunting knife, which is exactly 9 inches long, placed next to one for scale. As I was doing this, I got that feeling again, the one where you know you're being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the overwhelming urge to get out of there. I scanned the tree line but didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I followed the tracks as far as I could. They headed up toward a rocky ridge before disappearing on the harder ground. I thought about pushing further, but something in my gut told me to turn back. For once in my life, I listened to that instinct. On the drive home, I remembered something else. A story from around '95 about a family camping near Wood River, whose RV was rocked violently during the night. Just like what happened to Rick, they reported it to the Forest Service, thinking it might have been vandals, but they were the only people camping in that area that night. When I got home, I started researching. The screams we heard matched descriptions of what people call Sasquatch vocalizations. The footprints are consistent with reported Bigfoot tracks. The aggressive behavior toward vehicles, the height, the ability to move quickly through difficult terrain, it all fits. I know how this sounds. Before last week, I would have laughed at anyone telling me this story, but when you hear something like those screams, when you see tracks that shouldn't exist, when you connect all these encounters in the same area over decades, it makes you question what you think you know. I haven't told the boys what I found. They're still a bit shaken up from our fishing trip, and I don't want to scare them more. My wife thinks I'm being paranoid for not wanting them to go back to that spot, but she didn't hear what we heard. Last night, I finally worked up the courage to look at the photos I took of those tracks again. Something caught my eye that I hadn't noticed before. In the background of one of the images, partially obscured by the branches of a pine tree, there's what looks like a dark shape. It's blurry and could be nothing, but the more I stare at it, the more it looks like a large, upright figure watching me from about 50 yards away. I keep telling myself it's just my imagination playing tricks on me, that it's just the shadow of a tree or a rock. But deep down, I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt out there. Whatever's living in those woods around Wood River, it's been there for decades. It's seen 3 generations of my family now, and I can't shake the feeling that one day, one of us is going to do more than just hear it scream or find its tracks. I've got the fishing trip planned with the boys again next month. My wife thinks we should stick to our tradition. I haven't told her yet, but I'm not taking them back to that beaver pond. Some places in the wilderness are better left alone. Story 2. I've never been the type to believe in cryptids or monsters. My girlfriend Emma and I have always been pretty practical people. We're experienced hikers and campers, and we've had our fair share of wildlife encounters over the years. Bears, mountain lions, you name it. So what happened to us last summer at Waki Campground in the King Range wasn't something either of us was prepared for. I'm still trying to make sense of it, honestly. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway in late August. We'd been planning this trip for months, looking forward to some time away from our jobs and the constant notifications on our phones. The King Range on the northwest coast of California is absolutely stunning. They call it the Lost Coast for a reason. It's wild, remote, and the kind of place where you can truly disconnect. We arrived at Waki Campground around 4 in the afternoon. The place was practically deserted, which wasn't too surprising given it was a Thursday. There was only one other group there, a middle-aged couple who had set up camp on the far side of the grounds, maybe 200 yards from where we decided to pitch our tent. Perfect. We wanted solitude, and we were getting it. The evening started out perfectly. We set up our tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple dinner over our portable stove. Emma had brought a bottle of wine, and we sat by the fire talking about everything and nothing. The stars came out. Man, I've never seen them so bright, and around 10 we decided to turn in for the night. We had plans to hike along the coast the next day, and we wanted to get an early start. I remember checking my watch when we finally settled into our sleeping bags. It was 10:45. We'd turned off our headlamps and were just lying there, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was so peaceful. The occasional rustle of leaves, the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore maybe half a mile away. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard it. Thump. At first I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just Emma shifting in her sleeping bag. But then it came again. Thump. Thump. Heavy. Deliberate. Like footsteps, but not quite right. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. Emma's breathing had changed, so I knew she was awake too, listening. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah," I whispered back. "Sounds like footsteps. We've had bears sniffing around our campsite before. It's scary, but manageable. You make noise, you stand your ground, and they usually leave you alone. But this didn't sound like a bear. Bears move with a distinct 4-beat pattern. You can hear all 4 paws hitting the ground in sequence. This was different. This was a distinct 2-beat pattern. Thump, pause, thump, pause, bipedal. Walking on 2 legs. I reached for my phone to check the time. 11:23. The thumping continued, steady and methodical. About 1.5 seconds between each step. Slow, but purposeful. "That's not a bear," Emma whispered. Her voice was tight with tension. "No," I agreed. "Too heavy for a person, though." And it was heavy. Unnaturally heavy. Each thump seemed to reverberate through the ground. We were in our sleeping bags, ears practically pressed against the earth, and we could feel each impact. It was like someone dropping a sandbag from shoulder height, over and over. The footsteps circled our campsite, never getting too close but never moving away either, just circling. Sometimes they'd stop for a minute or two, and we'd think whatever it was had left. Then they'd start up again, coming from a different direction. By midnight, we were both wide awake, adrenaline coursing through our systems. I keep a hunting knife in my pack, not for hunting, just for safety, and I'd taken it out, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against something that sounded so massive. "What do you think it weighs?" Emma asked after a particularly heavy footfall made the ground beneath us vibrate. I'd been trying to estimate that myself. 500 pounds at least, I said. Maybe more. That's what I was thinking too. Now, I'm 6'2" and weigh around 200 pounds. I've had friends who weigh close to 300, but none of us could make the ground shake like that with a footstep. Not even close. Around 12:30, my bladder started screaming at me. I'd been ignoring it for as long as I could, but I was reaching my limit. The footsteps had moved to the far side of our campsite, so I figured this was my chance. "I need to pee," I told Emma. "I'm going to make a run for it." She grabbed my arm. "Are you crazy? It's still out there. I don't have a choice. I'll be quick." I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and slipped out, headlamp on. The night was cold and clear, the moon casting long shadows through the trees. I scanned the area with my light, but saw nothing unusual. No glowing eyes, no massive shape lurking at the tree line. Just our campsite, the fire now reduced to embers, and the dark forest beyond, and the footsteps had stopped, completely. The moment I stepped out of the tent, I did my business as quickly as possible, staying right next to the tent. The silence was almost worse than the footsteps. I felt watched, observed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead, despite the chill in the air. I practically dove back into the tent, zipping it up tight behind me. "It stopped," Emma said, "as soon as you went out there." "Yeah, I noticed." We waited, listening intently. For maybe 5 minutes there was nothing. Then, from about 100 feet away, it started again. Thump, pause, thump, pause. Only this time, it wasn't circling. It was coming closer. We lay there, clutching each other's hands as the footsteps approached our tent, 50 feet away, then 40, 30. Then they stopped again. I don't know how long we waited in that agonizing silence. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Then something brushed against the side of our tent. Not a footstep, but a deliberate touch, like someone or something running their hand along the fabric. Emma squeezed my hand so tight I thought my fingers might break. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. We were both frozen in terror. The touch moved along the length of the tent from one end to the other. Then it was gone, and the footsteps resumed, moving away from us now. Thump, pause, thump, pause. For the next hour, this pattern continued. The footsteps would circle our campsite, sometimes coming as close as 20 feet, sometimes retreating to 100 feet or more. Occasionally they'd stop, and the silence would stretch out unbearably. Then they'd start again. Around 1 in the morning, something changed. The steps became more deliberate, more purposeful, and they were moving away, heading deeper into the forest. The thumps grew fainter and fainter, until finally we couldn't hear them anymore. We didn't sleep. How could we? We lay there, wide awake, listening to every sound the forest made, waiting for those heavy footsteps to return. But they didn't. When the first light of dawn finally filtered through the trees, we packed up our camp in record time. We didn't bother with breakfast or coffee, we just wanted out of there. As we were loading the car, the other campers, the middle-aged couple, approached us. "You folks heading out early?" the man asked. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Change of plans." The woman gave me a knowing look. "Did you hear it too?" My heart skipped a beat. "Hear what?" "The walking," she said. "Around midnight. Heavy footsteps, too heavy to be human." Emma and I exchanged glances. "You heard it?" she asked. The couple nodded. "Third time we've heard it in these woods," the man said. "That's why we camp here, trying to catch a glimpse." "A glimpse of what?" I asked, though I was starting to get a sinking feeling in my stomach. The woman smiled. "Bigfoot. What else would it be?" I've always been a skeptic, always dismissed Bigfoot stories as nonsense, mistaken identifications, hoaxes, or tall tales. But lying there in that tent, feeling the ground vibrate with each massive footstep, hearing the methodical bipedal gait, feeling the deliberate touch on our tent, I can't explain it away. We've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs, but bears don't walk like that for extended periods, and they don't weigh enough to make the ground shake the way this did. We've looked up information about Bigfoot walking sounds, trying to find accounts similar to what we experienced. There's surprisingly little specific information out there, which makes me wonder how many other people have had experiences like ours, but never reported them. I don't know what was walking around our campsite that night. I never saw it. Never heard it make a sound other than those heavy, deliberate footsteps, but whatever it was, it knew we were there. It was curious about us, and it could have hurt us if it wanted to. We haven't been camping since. Maybe someday we will again, but not in the King Range, not at Waki Campground. Some experiences change you forever, and this was one of them. I went from being a complete skeptic to, well, I don't know what I am now. But I know what I heard, I know what I felt, and I know I never want to feel it again. Story 3. I've been holding this in for a long time. I need to get it off my chest, even if some of you think I'm crazy. I know what I saw. It happened on June 9th, 2017. My friend Taylor and I had been talking about all these weird stories coming out of Brush Creek Conservation Area, south of Bedford, Iowa. People were reporting strange things in the woods there, weird sounds at night, livestock acting spooked, and a couple of hikers claimed they'd seen something big moving through the trees. Taylor and I have always been fascinated by cryptids and unexplained phenomena. We're not the type to believe everything we hear, but we're open-minded enough to investigate. So we decided to check it out ourselves. Looking back, I wish we hadn't. We left my place around 5 in the morning. I remember checking my watch as we pulled out of the driveway, thinking it was way too early to be awake on a Friday. But we wanted to get there at first light to maximize our chances of seeing wildlife, or whatever else might be out there. The drive was about 40 minutes, and we spent most of it talking about what we might find. Taylor was more skeptical than I was, joking about how we'd probably just see some deer and maybe a raccoon if we were lucky. I was hoping for something more interesting, but I never expected what actually happened. We reached the conservation area just as the sun was starting to rise. The whole place was covered in this light morning mist that made everything look kind of surreal. We followed the GPS directions to a small parking area at the northern edge of the property, driving slowly down this narrow gravel road that cut through fields on both sides. I remember how quiet it was. Usually, early mornings in the countryside are full of bird calls and insect noises, but that day it felt unnaturally silent. I mentioned it to Taylor, who just shrugged it off, saying it was probably too early even for the birds. We were about a mile from the parking lot when it happened. Taylor was driving maybe 15 miles per hour on the gravel, and I was looking out the passenger window at this open field that stretched away to the north. There were some trees in the distance, and the mist was making everything look hazy. Then something moved in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought it was a bear, which would have been crazy enough since there aren't supposed to be bears in that part of Iowa. But what crossed the road about 80 feet ahead of us was no bear. This thing came from the field on my side, moving from north to south. It was on all fours, but not like any four-legged animal I've ever seen. It was massive, I mean truly huge, and covered in thick, dark hair. The hair wasn't uniform, though. I could see that it was shorter on its back, especially along the spine, while the hair on its shoulders and legs was longer and kind of hung down. Taylor slammed on the brakes, and we both just sat there, frozen. The creature moved with this bizarre grace that's hard to describe. It didn't bounce or gallop like a deer or a dog. It almost glided across the road, staying low to the ground. Its back was hunched in this unsettling way, and its head was tucked down, but I could tell the proportions were all wrong for any normal animal. It was like some nightmarish mix between a man and a gorilla. The speed was what really got me. Something that big shouldn't be able to move that fast. It crossed the entire width of the road in what seemed like 2 or 3 seconds and disappeared into the tree line on the other side. I fumbled for my phone to take a picture, but it was gone before I could even get it out of my pocket. We sat there in silence for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I finally found my voice, it came out as a whisper. "Did you see that?" I asked Taylor, who was white as a sheet and gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were pale. "It was just a big dog," she said, but her voice was shaking. "Maybe someone's Great Dane got loose." "That wasn't a dog," I said. "It was way too big, and it didn't move like a dog at all. I estimated it had to weigh at least 500 pounds, probably more. The way it moved was just wrong. And the silence. That's another thing that keeps haunting me. Something that sighs crossing a gravel road should make noise. Paws or hooves on loose gravel make a distinctive sound. But this thing moved across without making a sound that we could hear from inside the car. "We should go back and look for tracks," I suggested, already reaching for my seatbelt. "The ground's soft from the rain yesterday. There should be prints." Taylor shook her head violently. "No way. We're not getting out of this car." "But we need to document this. No one will believe us without evidence." "We're not telling anyone about this," Taylor said, putting the car in drive. "It was just a big dog or maybe a deer that looked weird in the mist. That's all." But I knew better. I've seen plenty of deer and dogs in my life. This wasn't either of those. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders too broad, the limbs too long, and the way it moved. I still can't get that image out of my head. Taylor drove us to the parking area, and we sat there for about 20 minutes, neither of us wanting to get out. The original plan had been to hike some of the trails, but that was clearly not happening anymore. Eventually, Taylor turned the car around, and we headed back home, taking the same road. I kept my eyes peeled as we passed the spot where we'd seen the creature, but there was nothing there, no evidence that anything had crossed that road just an hour earlier. Part of me wanted to ask Taylor to stop so I could look for tracks, but I could tell from her expression that it wasn't up for discussion. The drive home was mostly silent. I tried bringing it up once. "Taylor, you know that wasn't a dog, right?" But she shut me down immediately. "Melissa, please," she said. "Can we just forget about it? I don't want to talk about it." When we got back to my place, Taylor made me promise not to tell anyone what we'd seen. She was really shaken up. I agreed just to calm her down, but I knew I wouldn't be able to keep that promise forever. What we saw was real, and it deserves to be documented. Taylor and I don't talk much anymore. After that day, she seemed to want distance from me, probably because I'm a walking reminder of something she'd rather forget. The few times we've met up since then, she avoids any mention of that morning. If I try to bring it up, she changes the subject or finds an excuse to leave. I've spent countless hours researching since then. I've read every book and article I could find about Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings. Most accounts describe these creatures walking upright on two legs, but there are some reports of them moving on all fours, especially when they're trying to move quickly or stay hidden. The more I learn, the more convinced I am that what we saw that morning was a Sasquatch. The size, the shape, the movement pattern, it all fits, and the location makes sense too. Brush Creek is pretty remote, with miles of undisturbed forest and plenty of water sources. It's exactly the kind of place where something could live undetected by humans. I've thought about going back there many times. I've even driven to the area a couple of times by myself. But I've never had the courage to go down that particular road again. Something about that place now feels forbidden to me. It's like my brain is sending warning signals. Don't go back there. Don't tempt fate again. What bothers me most is the feeling that we were being watched. Looking back on it now, I realize that the unusual silence that morning wasn't natural. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. I've wondered if our presence there was some kind of intrusion, if we stumbled into something's territory without realizing it. The encounter lasted maybe 5 seconds total, but it changed something fundamental in me. I can't look at wooded areas the same way anymore. When I'm hiking or camping, I'm constantly scanning the trees, listening for sounds that don't belong. I've become hyper-aware of my surroundings in a way I never was before. Sometimes I wonder if Taylor was right, if we should have just forgotten about it and moved on. But I can't. What we saw was real. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, it wasn't a deer, and it definitely wasn't a dog. It was something that shouldn't exist according to science, but it does. I haven't told many people about this. My brother knows, and a couple of close friends who I trust not to think I'm crazy. Most people would just dismiss it as my imagination or a case of mistaken identity. But I know what I saw, and I know that there are things in this world that we don't understand, things that live on the edges of our awareness. That day changed me. I'm more cautious now, especially in wooded areas. I never hike alone anymore. And I always carry a camera with me, just in case. I kick myself every day for not being quicker with my phone that morning. A single photo would have changed everything. I still live about an hour away from Brush Creek, and sometimes at night, when it's quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I find myself thinking about what's out there in those woods. Is it still there? Has anyone else seen it? Are there more of them? I check the local news regularly, looking for any strange reports from the area. So far, nothing has made the papers, but that doesn't mean nothing's happening. Most people wouldn't report something like this for fear of ridicule. I've thought about contacting some Bigfoot research organizations, but I don't have any evidence to share with them. No photos, no footprints, nothing but my testimony. And without Taylor backing me up, it's just another unverifiable story. So I keep it mostly to myself. This secret knowledge that there are things in this world that we can't explain. That morning in June changed the way I see reality. It opened a door in my mind that can't be closed again. I know what I saw crossing that road. It wasn't anything that should exist according to our scientific understanding of the world, but it was there, as real as the car I was sitting in, and somewhere out there in the woods of southern Iowa, it's still roaming free, unknown and undiscovered by science. And sometimes, when I'm driving on country roads early in the morning and see the mist hanging over the fields, I find myself slowing down and watching the tree line, half afraid and half hoping that I'll catch another glimpse of something impossible. Story 4. I still don't know how to fully explain what happened to me and my buddy Mike back in the spring of 2015. We were just 17, looking for some fun during spring break. My parents were cool with me taking a couple days to go camping as long as I checked in regularly. Since it was midweek in April, we figured Black River would be practically deserted, and we were right. We arrived around 11 in the morning on a Wednesday. The camping area was completely empty, which was exactly what we wanted. Mike and I had been planning this trip for weeks, just two high school juniors hanging out, doing whatever we wanted without anyone telling us what to do. I'd borrowed my brother's .22 rifle. He'd shown me how to use it properly, and I'd been shooting since I was 14, so it wasn't a big deal. We weren't planning to hunt or anything, just wanted to set up some cans and bottles for target practice. The first few hours were awesome. We set up our tent, got a fire pit ready for later, and pulled out the horseshoes my dad had packed for us. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, maybe 65 degrees with a slight breeze. After a couple games of horseshoes, which I won by the way, we decided to try some target shooting. We set up about 8 or 9 cans on a log about 30 yards from where we were standing. I remember Mike was impressed when I hit 7 out of 9. He'd only been shooting a couple times before, so I showed him how to hold the rifle properly, how to breathe when taking a shot. Basic stuff my brother taught me. Around 2 in the afternoon, we got kind of bored with shooting at stationary targets and decided to head down to the river. The Black River was running low that time of year, moving really slow. We figured we could float some cans on the water and try shooting them as they drifted by. Moving targets would be more challenging. The riverbank sloped down pretty steep from our campsite, maybe a 45-degree angle for about 30 yards. When we got to the bottom, the ground flattened out with about 10 feet of sand and mud before the water. On the other side of the river, which was maybe 30 feet across at that point, was nothing but dense forest. The trees grew right up to the edge of the water over there. We'd been down there for maybe 45 minutes, taking turns with the rifle, when I suddenly realized something felt off. I can't really explain it, but it was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. I'd grown up camping and hunting in Michigan, so I was used to the constant background noise of the woods, birds singing, squirrels chattering, leaves rustling, but now there was nothing, absolutely nothing. "Mike, you notice how quiet it got?" I asked him. He looked up from loading another can with rocks to make them float better in the current and glanced around. "Yeah, that's weird, like really weird." We both stood there for a minute just listening to the silence. No wind, no birds, nothing but the faint sound of water moving slowly past us. I felt goosebumps spreading across my arms despite the warm afternoon sun. That's when we heard the first sound from across the river. It's hard to describe exactly what it was. Kind of a low rumble, almost like someone clearing their throat, but deeper and longer. At first I thought maybe it was a bear, but it didn't sound quite right for that. "Did you hear that?" Mike whispered, his eyes fixed on the tree line across the water. Before I could answer, we heard more noises. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, like something was moving through the underbrush toward the river. Whatever it was, it sounded big, really big. I realized we only had one bullet left in the rifle. I remembered we'd left the box of ammo up at the campsite. "I'm gonna run up and grab more bullets," I told Mike, starting to feel a little nervous, just in case it's a bear or something. Mike nodded, his eyes still locked on the trees across the river. I turned and started jogging up the slope toward our campsite. I'd made it maybe halfway up when I heard a loud crack, like a thick branch snapping, followed immediately by Mike yelling, "Jason! Jason!" The panic in his voice made me spin around instantly. Mike was running toward me, his face white as a sheet, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the river, with one foot in the muddy bank on the other side, was something. I say something because even now, 7 years later, I still don't have a better word for it. It wasn't trying to hide, it was just standing there watching us. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, maybe 7, 8 feet high and wide, not fat, but massive. Broad shoulders, thick body. The thing that really stood out was its hair, reddish brown, long and kind of matted, hanging down over its face and body. I couldn't make out facial features clearly from that distance, but I could see its outline perfectly against the trees behind it. It didn't move. It just stood there, breathing. I could hear its breaths from across the river, slow, deep inhales and exhales. Its arms hung down at its sides, longer than they should be, ending in what looked like huge hands. Mike reached me, grabbing my arm. "What the fuck is that thing?" he hissed, his voice cracking. I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone completely dry. The thing across the river still hadn't moved, but I could feel it watching us. It wasn't shaped like a bear. It was standing on 2 legs, its posture more like a person. But no person looks like that. No person is that size. I suddenly remembered the rifle in my hands. With shaking fingers I raised it, not pointing directly at the creature, but up in the air. I hesitated for a second, then pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed through the silent forest. The creature didn't run. It didn't charge. It just took one step backward, still watching us. That's when Mike and I did the only sensible thing. We ran. We fucking ran like our lives depended on it, scrambling up that hill faster than I've ever moved before or since. We didn't stop to break down the tent or gather our stuff. We just grabbed our car keys from inside the tent and jumped into my old Civic. I remember my hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The tires spun in the dirt as we peeled out of there. For the first 10 minutes of the drive, neither of us said a word. Mike just kept looking back through the rear window like he expected to see that thing running after us on the road. Finally, when we were safely on the highway heading home, Mike broke the silence. "What was that?" he asked, his voice still shaky. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I really don't know." When I got home, my mom could tell something was wrong. I wasn't planning to tell her. I figured she'd think we were making it up or had seen a bear and panicked. But something about the way she looked at me, concerned and confused about why we were back so early, made me spill everything. She listened to the whole story without interrupting. then just sighed and said, "Jason, are you sure it wasn't just a bear standing on its hind legs?" "Mom, I know what a bear looks like," I insisted. "This wasn't a bear, it was something else." She still looked skeptical, so I got frustrated and said, "I'll take a lie detector test if you want. That's how sure I am." That seemed to get her attention. She didn't say much after that, just told me to try to get some rest. The next day, Mike and I talked on the phone for hours, going over every detail of what we'd seen. We both agreed on the same description: the height, the reddish-brown hair, the way it just stood there watching us. We decided we should go back for our stuff, but neither of us wanted to go alone, and both of us were too freaked out to go back right away. That Sunday, my brother-in-law Tom offered to go with us. Tom was a big guy, 6'3", and built like a linebacker. He'd been in the army and wasn't scared of much. He brought his shotgun, and we took my dad's rowboat strapped to the top of Tom's truck. When we got back to the campsite, everything was exactly as we'd left it. The tent was still up, our cooler was still there, though a raccoon had gotten into it, and the horseshoes were scattered where we'd been playing. Tom could tell we were nervous, so he just said, "Show me where you saw this thing." We walked down to the river, and I pointed across to where the creature had been standing. Tom nodded, then dragged the rowboat down to the water. "I'm going to take a look over there," he said. Mike and I waited anxiously on our side as Tom rowed across. We watched him pull the boat up on the muddy bank and start examining the area. After about 15 minutes, he waved us over. "You guys need to see this," he called. Neither of us wanted to cross that river, but we couldn't look like cowards in front of Tom, so we took turns rowing across in the boat. When we got there, Tom was standing near the tree line, looking down at the ground. "Look at these," he said, pointing. There in the mud were footprints, big footprints, way bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen. Tom wore size 13 boots, and these prints made his look small in comparison. The strangest thing was that they only had 4 toes, 4 huge toes pressed deep into the mud. "And check this out," Tom said, walking a few feet to a tree nearby. About 7 feet up the trunk was a clump of reddish-brown hair, stuck to the bark like something had brushed against it. Tom pulled out his pocket knife and carefully scraped the hair into a plastic baggie he had in his pocket. "I know a guy at the university who might be able to tell us what kind of animal this came from," he said. "But as far as I know, that never happened." Tom gave me the hair sample later, and I still have it somewhere in my desk drawer. We never got it properly analyzed. I think part of me doesn't want to know for sure. About a year later, I was working a summer job at a hardware store near Black River. An Amish man who lived near the campground came in for supplies one day. Somehow we got to talking about the area, and I mentioned I'd been camping there once. He got this strange look on his face and asked exactly where I'd been. When I described our campsite by the river, he nodded slowly and said very quietly, "Someone in our community saw something along that river last spring, something that shouldn't have been there." He wouldn't say anything more about it, but that was enough for me. I wasn't crazy. Mike wasn't crazy. We saw something that day at Black River, something I still can't explain. I haven't been camping since... Story 5. I've sat on this for over 40 years now, but I think it's time to share. Honestly, I still don't have any real answers, and the memories still make my skin crawl whenever I'm alone at night. This happened back in the spring of '80, when I was working at this fish farm near Cold Springs, Utah. I'd been at that job for about 3 years by then. It was decent work, quiet, peaceful, and gave me plenty of time to think. The owner was an older guy who mostly stayed in town, so I had the run of the place most days. The farm had 4 large ponds, north, south, east, and west, and we raised rainbow trout for restaurants and stores in the area. For a couple years before this happened, we'd been having problems with fish disappearing. At first, the boss thought it was just theft, maybe locals coming in at night to grab free dinner. So we started keeping better count of our stock, and sure enough, we were losing anywhere from 20 to 50 fish a week sometimes. The boss installed some basic security lights. but it didn't help much. I remember that morning so clearly. It was early May, about 4:30 in the morning. I always started early to beat the heat. The air was still crisp, and there was this heavy mist hanging over the ponds. I had my thermos of coffee and was making my rounds to check water quality and feed the morning ration. I headed to the east pond first, like always. It was furthest from the main building and closest to the tree line that ran along the property. As I got closer, I noticed something weird about the lawn around the pond. At first, in the dim light, I thought someone had scattered pieces of trash all over. But as I got closer, I realized they were fish, dead trout. I'm talking dozens of them, scattered in a rough circle about 15 feet from the water's edge. Some were completely intact, just dead. Others were partially eaten, and a bunch were missing their heads entirely. It looked like someone had just pulled them out and tossed them aside. My first thought was that we finally caught our thieves, maybe some kids who got spooked and dropped their haul. But that didn't explain the half-eaten ones, or why they'd be stupid enough to leave evidence scattered everywhere. I put down my feed bucket and walked closer to examine the mess. The intact fish were still fairly fresh, definitely from overnight. As I moved toward the pond's edge, I noticed something in the mud that made my blood run cold. Footprints, but not normal footprints. These things were massive, easily 14 inches long. They were clearly foot-shaped with 5 toes, but the toes seemed to curl down into the mud, like they had gripped into it. The stride between them was huge, maybe 4 to 5 feet apart, and they were deep. Whatever made them was heavy. I followed the prints with my flashlight. They came from the woods to the east, circled the pond, and then there were prints showing where something had jumped right into the pond. I could see where the bank was disturbed, where it had climbed out again, leaving more of those massive prints heading back to the woods. I'm not a small guy. I was 6 foot 190 back then, but looking at those prints made me feel tiny, human-shaped, but definitely not human. Too big, too strange. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared. I hurried back to the main building and called my boss, who told me to call Fish and Game right away. 2 officers showed up about 2 hours later. I expected them to laugh it off, but they took it surprisingly seriously. The older officer, Peterson, took one look at the footprints and got real quiet. He had this look on his face like he'd seen this before. They brought plaster with them and made casts of the best prints. "Mind if we wade in?" Peterson asked, already rolling up his pants. I nodded, and both officers carefully stepped into the pond. The water was clear enough that we could see the bottom, and Peterson pointed out where the moss on the bottom was disturbed in a path across the pond. "Something big walked through here," he said. "Recently, too." The younger officer, whose name I don't remember, kept looking nervously at the tree line while they worked. They photographed everything, collected a couple of the partially eaten fish in evidence bags, and took the plaster casts once they dried. "We'll look into this," Peterson said as they were leaving. "Lock up at night and maybe don't work alone for a while." That last part stuck with me. Why would a fish and game officer tell me not to work alone because of some strange footprints? I spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess and trying to account for how many fish we'd lost. The boss came out later and walked the property with me. He'd been dealing with fish farms for 25 years and said he'd never seen anything like it. "Coyotes don't do this," he said, looking at the pattern of the dead fish. "Bears don't either. They take the fish away, not leave them scattered like this." My sister-in-law, Diane, lived in a trailer on the property with my brother, who also worked at the farm, but on different shifts than me. When I went to tell them what happened, Diane went pale. She'd been avoiding talking about something for weeks and finally admitted why. "About a month ago," she said, her voice shaking. "I was up late watching TV. Mike was working the night shift. I heard this, I don't know, this breathing sound outside the window. Our trailers were up on blocks about 4 feet off the ground. The windows were about 7 feet up from the ground. I thought it was the wind," she continued, "but it was rhythmic. like something breathing. When I went to check, I saw a face looking in at me. It wasn't human, Jay. It had these red eyes, glowing almost, and it was looking down into our window. She started crying then. It would have to be at least 9 feet tall to look down into that window. I screamed and it disappeared. I told Mike I saw a peeper, but I was too scared to say what I really saw. I didn't sleep well that night, or for many nights after. I kept the shotgun by my bed and started bringing my German Shepherd Rex with me for the early morning feedings. The weird thing was, Rex refused to go near the East Pond. He'd stop about 50 yards away and start whining and backing up. Dogs know things we don't. About a week later, Peterson from Fish and Game showed up again, alone this time. He had the plaster cast with him. "Thought you might want this back," he said, handing it to me. "What did you find out?" I asked. He looked uncomfortable. "Officially? Nothing. Unknown predator. That's what the report says." I waited, feeling like there was more. He sighed and looked around like he was making sure we were alone. "Off the record? This isn't the first set of prints like this I've seen. Had a case over in Morgan County 3 years back. Cattle mutilations. Same kind of prints. Same size. What made them?" I asked. He shook his head. "Department doesn't want us speculating. Bad for tourism, bad for hunting licenses. But locals up in the mountains, they've got stories going back generations. They call it different names. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the hairy man." I almost laughed, but Peterson wasn't smiling. "I've been a wildlife officer for 22 years, he said. "I know every predator in these mountains. Whatever left those prints isn't in any wildlife manual." He left after that, and I never heard from Fish and Game again, but the incidents didn't stop. We kept finding fish scattered around the ponds every couple of weeks, always the East Pond, always at night. The boss installed better security lights and even a primitive alarm system, but it never caught anything. One night in June, I decided to stake out the pond myself. I set up in the equipment shed about 100 yards from the East Pond with a clear view. I had the shotgun, a spotlight, and a thermos of coffee. I was determined to see what was taking our fish. Around 2 in the morning, the mist rolled in heavy over the ponds. I was fighting to stay awake when I heard it. Splashing, not like a fish jumping, but like something large moving through water. I grabbed the spotlight and shotgun and eased open the shed door. The security lights gave just enough illumination to see the pond's surface, disturbed by ripples. Something was in there. I raised the spotlight, ready to switch it on, when I heard another sound that froze me in place. It was like grunting. Low, guttural sounds coming from the pond. Not animal, not human. Something in between. Then I heard heavy, wet footsteps moving onto the bank. The security light by the pond flickered and went out. I stood there, paralyzed. The logical part of my brain said to turn on the spotlight to see what it was, but some deeper, more primitive part kept my finger from pressing that switch. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want it to see me. The wet footsteps moved across the grass, slow, deliberate. I could hear water dripping from whatever it was. It was moving toward the trees, away from me. Finally, when I thought it was far enough away, I gathered my courage and flicked on the spotlight. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating the edge of the pond and the tree line beyond. There, just at the edge of the light's reach, I caught a glimpse of something large and dark, disappearing into the trees. It was tall, much taller than a man, with broad shoulders. That's all I saw before it was gone. The next morning, I found more dead fish and fresh footprints. I quit the job 2 weeks later, made up some excuse about finding better work in Salt Lake City. The boss understood. We'd lost nearly 30% of our stock by then. I've never told this story publicly before. For years, I tried to convince myself it was a bear, maybe standing on its hind legs, or some local playing an elaborate prank, but I know what Diane saw looking into that window. I know what made those footprints. And sometimes, on humid nights when the air feels heavy, I still wake up thinking I hear those wet footsteps outside my window. The plaster cast sat in my garage for years until a flood damaged it beyond recognition. Sometimes I wish I still had it. Proof that I'm not crazy. But maybe it's better this way. Some things in this world aren't meant to be explained, and some predators are better left alone in the dark. Story 6. I've never told the full story publicly before, but I think it's time. Even after almost 14 years, what happened still feels raw. I was an experienced hunter, still am, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered that day in Okala National Forest. It was early November 2009, right in the heart of rifle buck season. The weather was perfect, mid-60s, slightly overcast, with that crisp fall feeling that makes for good hunting. I'd been hunting these woods for over 15 years at that point, knew the terrain like the back of my hand. This wasn't my first rodeo, is what I'm saying. I'd parked my truck at one of the designated areas near the old mining access roads. These spots were perfect because they were far enough from the more popular hunting areas that you didn't have to worry about weekend warriors stomping around scaring off all the game. I'd been up since 4 that morning, had already spent a few hours in my usual spot without any luck, so I decided to try a different area deeper in the forest. Around 1 in the afternoon, I was walking along this old mining and logging road. Barely more than a dirt path at that point, hadn't been used actively in years. The forest was dense on both sides, mostly pine and oak, with that thick undergrowth that's typical for Okala. It was quiet, almost too quiet, thinking back on it now. Usually you'd hear birds, squirrels rustling around, maybe distant sounds from other hunters, but there was nothing. Complete silence, except for my own footsteps. I remember checking my phone, no signal of course, and thinking I'd give this new spot another hour before heading back. That's when I first noticed the smell. At first, I thought maybe there was a dead animal nearby, but it wasn't quite that. It was this overwhelming stench that hit me like a wall, like a mix of wet dog, sweaty armpits, and something else I couldn't place. Something musky and wild. I've smelled plenty of animals in my time, deer, bear, boar, you name it, but this was different, more intense, more human, but not quite. I pulled my bandana up over my nose and kept walking, figuring maybe I'd passed by some kind of animal carcass or something. The smell got stronger the further I went down this road. That should have been my first warning sign, but I kept going. I'd gone maybe another quarter mile when I saw it. About 80 yards ahead, on the left side of the road, there was this dark figure hunched over near the tree line. My first thought was that it was another hunter field dressing a kill, but something about the size and shape wasn't right. I stopped dead in my tracks and slowly reached for my binoculars. I always keep them hanging around my neck when I'm moving through the woods. As I raised them to my eyes, the figure stood up. Jesus Christ. Even now, writing this makes my hands shake. What stood up wasn't a hunter, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before in these woods or anywhere else. Through my binoculars, I could see it clearly. It was tall, easily 7.5 feet, maybe more. It had this massive, bulky frame with incredibly wide shoulders, not fat, but solid, built like a linebacker on steroids. The whole body was covered in this dark brown hair or fur, maybe 3 to 4 inches long. It wasn't matted or tangled like you might expect from a bear, but smooth and uniform across its body. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, even with the binoculars, but I could see that its head sat directly on those massive shoulders, no neck to speak of. The arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees. I stood there frozen, just watching this thing through my binoculars. It seemed to be examining something on the ground, maybe berries or plants. It was using its hands, not paws, hands, with what looked like deliberate movements. That's when I screwed up. I shifted my weight and stepped on a dry branch. The crack wasn't particularly loud, but in that dead silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature's head snapped up immediately, turning directly toward me. Then it made this sound, a deep, rumbling grunt that carried clearly through the still air. It wasn't a bear's growl or a deer's snort. It was something else entirely, something that made every hair on my body stand on end. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. Me through my binoculars, it with eyes I couldn't quite make out but could definitely feel. I've had stare-downs with black bears before, had close encounters with wild boar, but nothing has ever made me feel the primal fear I felt in that moment. Then it stood up completely straight, rising to its full height. It was even more massive than I first thought. Its chest was huge, easily twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small guy. It just stood there watching me, not moving. I lowered my binoculars slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, but the thought of raising it never even crossed my mind. Something told me that would be the worst possible thing I could do. The creature took a step forward, still facing me, then another. Its movements were smooth, not lumbering like a bear's. It moved like an athlete, deliberate and controlled. Every step it took toward me sent another jolt of panic through my system. After about 3 steps, it stopped again. Then it did something that still haunts me. It tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious, like it was studying me the same way I was studying it. I started slowly backing up, one small step at a time, never taking my eyes off the figure. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mouth had gone completely dry. I remember thinking, this isn't happening. This can't be real. But it was real. Too real. When I'd backed up maybe 10 yards, the creature made that grunting sound again, louder this time. Then it raised one of its arms and, I swear this is true, it seemed to wave me away. Not a friendly wave, but a dismissive gesture, like it was telling me to get lost. That's when I heard something crash in the woods to my right. My head snapped in that direction instinctively. Stupid move, but I couldn't see anything through the dense undergrowth. When I looked back at the creature, it had moved. It was now at the edge of the tree line, on the left side of the road, partially obscured by the foliage. I don't know what came over me then, but I called out, "Hello?" My voice cracked like a teenager's. Immediately, I regretted making any noise at all. The response was immediate and terrifying. From somewhere in the woods, not from the creature I could see, but from somewhere else, came this high-pitched whistling scream. It started low, then rose sharply, like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It wasn't human, wasn't any animal I recognized, and it made my blood run cold. The creature I could still partially see suddenly turned and moved into the forest with shocking speed. For something so large, it disappeared into the trees almost instantly, barely disturbing the vegetation as it went. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. But I could still hear movement in the woods from multiple directions now, cracking branches, rustling leaves, but strangely muffled, like whatever was moving was trying to be quiet, despite its size. That's when I realized I might be dealing with more than one of these things, and they might be trying to flank me or circle around behind me. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran. I turned and ran back the way I'd come, not sprinting but moving as fast as I could while still watching where I was going. I didn't want to trip and fall, not out there, not with those things nearby. As I ran, I heard more of those whistling screams, followed by what sounded like wood knocking on wood, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct sounds, then silence, then 3 more from a different direction. They were communicating, they were coordinating. I ran for what felt like miles, but was probably only about half a mile before I slowed down to catch my breath. The woods had gone silent again. The smell was gone. I stood there, gasping for air, listening intently for any sign of pursuit, but there was nothing. After a minute or 2, I continued back toward my truck at a quick walk, constantly checking over my shoulder, my rifle now in my hands rather than over my shoulder. Not that I had any intention of using it. Somehow I knew that would only make things worse, but the weight of it in my hands was reassuring. It took me about 45 minutes to get back to my truck. I didn't see or hear anything else unusual along the way, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched the entire time. When I finally reached the parking area, there were 2 other trucks there that hadn't been there when I arrived. Other hunters, I assumed. I wondered if they'd seen or heard anything strange. I almost approached them to ask, but what would I say? Hey, did you guys see a Bigfoot back there? They'd think I was crazy or drunk, so I just got in my truck, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes trying to process what had happened. I've gone back and forth over the years about what I actually saw that day. There are times when I've convinced myself it must have been a bear, standing upright momentarily, or maybe some kind of elaborate hoax, someone in a costume, though that doesn't explain the multiple sounds from different directions or how quickly and silently it moved through dense forest. But in my heart, I know what I saw, I know what I heard and smelled. I've spent my entire adult life in those woods. I know every animal that lives there, how they move, how they sound, how they smell. What I encountered that day wasn't any of them. It's been almost 14 years now, and I've never gone back to that specific area of the forest. I still hunt, still spend time in Okala, but I stick to the more populated areas now, where other hunters are always within shouting distance. I've only told this story to a few close friends and my wife. Most of them think I'm exaggerating or misinterpreted what I saw. My wife believes me, though. She says she's never seen me as shaken up as I was when I got home that day. I've done some research since then, read up on Bigfoot sightings in Florida. Turns out there have been quite a few reports from Okala National Forest over the years. Some of them describe experiences very similar to mine. The smell, the wood knocking, the whistling screams. I don't know if what I saw was a Sasquatch, a skunk ape, or something else entirely. I just know it wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal, and there was more than one of them. Sometimes when I'm in the woods now, even in completely different areas, I'll catch a whiff of that same smell, just for a second, or I'll feel eyes on me from the dense undergrowth. When that happens, I turn around and head back to my truck. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some creatures are better left undisturbed. I still have nightmares about that grunt, that dismissive wave, those whistling screams. But what haunts me most is the intelligence I saw in that encounter. Whatever it wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. It was thinking, it was communicating, it was coordinating with others of its kind, and it wanted me gone. Story 7. I've gone camping and hunting my whole life, pretty much. Growing up in East Texas, it was just part of what we did. My dad taught me to hunt when I was 12, and by the time I was 23 in 1999, I'd spent more nights under the stars than most people do in a lifetime. But there's one trip I've never been able to fully explain, even to myself. I don't talk about it much because people either think I'm crazy or making it up for attention. I'm not. I wish I was. It was the second week of deer season in November 1999. Me, my parents, my little brother Jake, and 2 of my buddies from college, Sean and Dennis, were camping in the Sabine National Forest. We'd been going to the same general area for years, but this time we found this perfect spot near a clearing in the pine woods that looked promising for deer. The first couple days were completely normal. We set up camp, did some scouting, and I even bagged a nice 8-point buck on day 2. We hung it from a tree at the edge of our camp to drain and cool overnight, planning to process it the next day. On the 3rd evening, a Tuesday I think, around 6:30, my parents decided they needed to get some more ice and some other supplies from town. Jake went with them because, well, he was 15 and bored. That left me, Sean, and Dennis at camp. Sean's this huge dude, like 6'8", played basketball in high school. Dennis and I are both average height. We were just hanging around the fire, drinking beers, bullshitting about nothing important. The sun set around 5:30, and by 6:45, it was properly dark. We had our campfire going pretty good, and a couple battery lanterns. I remember checking my watch and thinking my parents would probably be back in about an hour. That's when we first heard it. There was this weird rustling sound coming from the woods behind our tents. At first, I figured it was just a raccoon or possum or something, but it kept getting louder. Then we heard what sounded like a branch snapping, not a twig, like a serious branch. The three of us kind of looked at each other. Dennis was like, probably just a deer, but none of us really believed that. I grabbed my flashlight and said we should check it out. In hindsight, that was stupid, but we'd been drinking, and honestly, I thought maybe it was some asshole from another campsite messing with us. There were a few other hunters camped within a mile or so of us. We walked maybe 30 yards into the trees. It was dark as hell under the pines, and our flashlights only cut through maybe 15 feet of the darkness. We stopped when we heard more movement ahead of us, something big moving through the underbrush. "Hello?" I called out. "Someone there?" Nothing, just silence. Then Sean grabbed my shoulder so hard it hurt. "Mitchell," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Look, by that big pine." I swung my flashlight where he was pointing, and that's when I saw it. Even now, 20-something years later, I can see it perfectly in my head. It was standing upright behind this massive pine tree, partially hidden, but definitely watching us. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, taller than Sean, which meant it had to be at least 7 feet. It had these massively broad shoulders and a thick chest. The arms were wrong, too long, hanging down almost to its knees. The whole body was covered in this dark, coarse-looking hair. But the face, Jesus, the face is what still gives me nightmares. It didn't really have a neck. The head just sat directly on the shoulders. The eyes caught the distant firelight and reflected back at us like a cat's or deer's eyes do at night, but bigger. The face was flat, almost pushed in, with a heavy brow. It wasn't human, but it wasn't fully animal either. We stood there frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. Then it made this sound, not a growl, not a grunt, something in between, and took a step toward us. We ran. We fucking ran. I'm not embarrassed to admit I've never moved so fast in my life. Dennis fell once, but scrambled back up so quickly I barely registered it. We burst back into our campsite, all talking at once, freaking out. "Did you see that fucking thing?" Sean kept saying over and over. "We need to get the fuck out of here." Dennis was almost crying. I was trying to think straight, but my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my temples. I grabbed my rifle from the tent, a Remington 30-06 I'd had for years, and checked that it was loaded. Sean and Dennis did the same with their guns. As we were trying to decide what to do, we heard a gunshot from one of the other campsites, maybe half a mile away. Then another. Then we could hear shouting and car engines starting up. Whatever we'd seen, it seemed like others had seen it too. "They're leaving," Dennis said. "We should go too." But my parents had the truck and we had no way of contacting them. Cell phones barely worked out there even if we'd had them, which none of us did back then. We were stuck until they got back. We built the fire up as big as we safely could and positioned the lanterns in a perimeter around our campsite, trying to create a circle of light. We sat back to back in the middle, rifles across our laps, watching the tree line. That's when things got even worse. About 15 minutes after we'd run back to camp, I noticed movement at the edge of the light, not just in one spot, but in several. I nudged Sean and pointed silently. There were shapes moving just beyond where our light reached, at least 4 or 5 of them. They were circling our camp, staying just out of clear sight, but I could see enough to know they were the same as what we'd seen in the woods. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call them, one of them positioned itself across the dirt road that led to our campsite. It was pacing back and forth, like it was guarding the entrance, like it was making sure we couldn't leave. "They're surrounding us," I whispered. The worst part was the silence. They made almost no sound as they moved. Occasionally we'd hear a soft grunt or that weird rustling noise, but mostly they were quiet, just watching us, studying us. Every few minutes one would move closer to the light, then back away again. I kept checking my watch. 7:30 passed, then 8. Where the hell were my parents? I was terrified they'd run into these things on the road. I was equally terrified they wouldn't come back at all, and we'd be stuck there all night. The creatures kept their distance, but never left. At one point, around 8:15, Sean fired a warning shot into the air. The shapes retreated deeper into the darkness for a few minutes, but then they were back, continuing their silent patrol of our perimeter. "What do they want?" Dennis kept asking. None of us had an answer. Around 8:45, we heard the rumble of my dad's truck coming up the dirt road. I've never been so relieved in my life. The headlights swept through the trees, and the creature that had been blocking the road melted away into the forest. My dad pulled up, looking confused at our setup with the lanterns and us sitting there with our rifles. My mum and Jake got out, carrying bags from the store. "What's going on?" my dad asked, immediately sensing something was wrong. We tried to explain what we'd seen, all talking over each other. My dad looked skeptical, but my mom noticed something over my shoulder and gasped. I spun around and caught a glimpse of one of the creatures, just at the edge of the light, before it disappeared again. "We need to leave," my mom said firmly. "Now." No one argued. We threw our sleeping bags and essential gear into the truck and my dad's SUV in record time. I glanced over at our hanging deer as we were loading up and realized with a shock that it was gone. The rope had been cut or broken. We drove to the nearest town, about 20 miles away, and got rooms at this crappy roadside motel. None of us slept much. We kept trying to make sense of what we'd seen, coming up with explanations that might be more rational than Bigfoot, but nothing else fit. The next morning, we drove back to the campsite to collect the rest of our gear. What we found made my blood run cold. The entire campsite was destroyed. Both tents had been ripped open, the poles snapped like twigs. Our coolers were smashed to pieces, the contents scattered everywhere. Gear that we'd left behind was thrown in every direction. There were these huge humanoid footprints in the mud around the site, at least 15 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. And there were drag marks leading from where our deer had been hanging into the woods. We gathered what was salvageable, which wasn't much, and got the hell out of there. We didn't report it to anyone official. What would we say? Who would believe us? We just packed up and left, and I've never been back to that part of the forest again. I've spent years researching, trying to understand what happened that night. I've read about other Bigfoot encounters, talked to a few people who claim to have had similar experiences. Some think they're just animals we haven't classified yet. Others think they're something more, something intelligent, maybe even dangerous when provoked. I don't know what to believe. What I do know is what I saw, what I felt, the intelligence in those eyes watching us from the darkness, the deliberate way they surrounded our camp, the systematic destruction of our site. These weren't just animals acting on instinct. There was purpose there, planning. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, feeling like I'm back in those woods, surrounded by those shapes moving just beyond the light, wondering what might have happened if my parents hadn't come back when they did. I don't hunt in deep woods anymore. I stick to open fields, places where I can see a long way in every direction, places where nothing can surround me, places where I can always see what's watching me from the trees. Story 8. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that day. My son Jake and I have been hunting together since he was old enough to hold a rifle, maybe around 12 or so. He's 17 now, and I've always tried to teach him everything my dad taught me about respecting nature and staying safe in the woods. We've seen all kinds of wildlife over the years, bears, cougars, you name it, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered last October. We'd been planning this trip for weeks. Jake had been stressed with school, and I thought getting away for a day would do us both some good. We picked a spot about 2 hours from our house, deep in the National Forest, where we'd had good luck with deer in previous seasons. The area is pretty remote, no marked trails, just wilderness. You really have to know your way around, or you'll get lost quickly. We arrived at our usual parking spot just before dawn. It was chilly, maybe 40 degrees, with that damp autumn feeling in the air. The leaves had started to change, creating this incredible canopy of reds and yellows above us. As we gathered our gear from the truck, I remember feeling this odd sensation, like something wasn't quite right. At the time, I chalked it up to the coffee I'd chugged on the drive up. Jake noticed it too. "Does it seem quieter than usual?" he asked as we shouldered our packs. He was right. Normally, the woods would be alive with birds and small animals at that hour. But that morning, everything felt muted somehow. I told him animals can sense when hunters are around, trying to sound confident, but looking back, I should have paid more attention to that warning sign. We hiked about 2 miles in, following a creek that eventually opened up to a series of small clearings where deer often came to feed. The plan was to set up in our usual spot, overlooking the largest clearing, and wait. The forest was thick with pine and oak, the ground covered in fallen leaves that made it impossible to move silently. Every step we took seemed amplified in the unusual quiet. Around mid-morning, we heard the first strange noise. It wasn't dramatic, just the sound of branches moving maybe 70 yards behind us. At first I figured it was a deer or maybe an elk, but the pattern was wrong. When deer move through brush, there's a certain rhythm to it, kind of sporadic. This was more deliberate, heavier, and it stopped whenever we stopped, like whatever was making the noise was listening to us. "Dad, you hear that?" Jake whispered, gripping his rifle a little tighter. "Yeah," I nodded, trying to pinpoint the direction. "Probably just a bear. Let's keep moving, but stay alert." We continued walking, but I could feel my heart rate picking up. I've encountered black bears plenty of times before, and they usually make themselves scarce when they sense humans. This felt different. Whatever was moving in the brush seemed to be paralleling our path, keeping a consistent distance. The footsteps in the underbrush continued for maybe 20 minutes. Sometimes they'd fade a bit, making me think whatever it was had lost interest, but then they'd return, louder than before. I started to get the feeling we were being herded, but I didn't say that to Jake. No need to spook him more than necessary. We decided to change direction, cutting across toward a different clearing than we'd originally planned. I figured if it was a curious bear, it might lose interest if we switched things up. That's when everything went sideways. As we stepped into a small clearing, not much bigger than my living room, I spotted something on the far side that made my blood run cold. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like those moments when you see something so out of context that your mind scrambles to make sense of it. Standing there, perfectly still among the trees, was what I can only describe as a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds. Before that day, I would have laughed if someone told me they'd seen Bigfoot. But there it was, and there's no other way to describe it. This thing was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It had a broad chest, covered in dark brown hair that looked matted in some places. Its arms hung unnaturally long, with hands that reached nearly to its knees. But it was the face that really got to me. Not quite like a gorilla's, but definitely not human either. It had this flat, wide nose and deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge. The eyes were what struck me most, dark and intelligent, watching us with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression. Time seemed to stop. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Jake was right beside me, frozen in the same state of shock. My rifle hung uselessly at my side. The thought of raising it never even crossed my mind. We were maybe 30 feet away from this creature, close enough that I could see its chest moving as it breathed. For what felt like minutes, but was probably only about 10 seconds, we just stared at each other. I swear I could feel it assessing us, deciding what to do. Then, with a deliberateness that still haunts me, it simply stepped backward into the trees. No sudden movements, no aggression. It just calmly backed away until the foliage swallowed it up. The spell broke as soon as it disappeared. I grabbed Jake's arm and whispered, "We need to go. Now." He nodded, his face pale as paper. We turned and started walking, not running, because something told me running would be the worst thing we could do, back in the direction of the truck. That's when the real terror set in. As we walked, trying to maintain a pace that balanced speed with caution, we could hear it following us. The sounds from earlier returned, branches moving, heavy footsteps, but now we knew what was making them. It kept pace with us, sometimes getting closer, sometimes dropping back, but always there, just out of sight. I kept my arm around Jake's shoulders, partly to comfort him, but mostly because I was terrified of being separated. My mind was racing through options. Should we confront it? Try to scare it off? Make a run for it? Every instinct told me to just keep moving steadily toward the truck. "Dad, it's following us," Jake whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I know, just keep walking." "Don't run," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "We're going to be fine," but I wasn't sure of that at all. In 25 years of hunting, I'd had my share of close calls with wildlife. I'd faced down an angry black bear once, when I accidentally got between her and her cubs. I'd been stalked by a mountain lion for nearly a mile along a ridge. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever filled me with the primal fear I felt, knowing that creature was tracking us through the woods. The walk back to the truck, which normally took about 45 minutes, felt like it lasted for hours. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had us spinning around, expecting to see that massive figure standing there. But it kept its distance, content to just follow. At one point, when we were maybe half a mile from the truck, everything went quiet. The footsteps stopped. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I paused, listening intently, and Jake squeezed my arm so hard it almost hurt. "Is it gone?" he whispered. Before I could answer, we heard a sound that I still can't properly describe. Something between a deep grunt and a low, rumbling growl. It came from somewhere off to our right, much closer than I expected. My skin crawled with goosebumps, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Keep moving," I said, my mouth so dry I could barely get the words out. We picked up our pace, no longer concerned about making noise. All I wanted was to get to the truck, to get us somewhere safe. The sounds of pursuit resumed, matching our increased speed. It was still following, still watching. When we finally broke through the tree line and saw the truck sitting there in the small dirt pull-off, I nearly cried with relief. We covered the last 100 yards at almost a run, fumbling with the keys as we reached the vehicle. Once inside, I locked the doors immediately and started the engine. Jake was breathing hard, his hands shaking as he set his rifle on the floor. "Did that really happen?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of the heater kicking in. I nodded, scanning the tree line through the windshield. Yeah, it happened. We sat there for maybe 10 minutes, not speaking, just processing. I kept expecting to see the creature emerge from the forest, but it never did. Eventually, I put the truck in gear and pulled away, driving much faster than was safe on those narrow forest roads. It's been almost a year now, and Jake and I have talked about it many times. We've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away as a bear walking on its hind legs or some other logical explanation. But we both know what we saw. That was no bear. No known animal moves like that, looks like that. We haven't been back to those woods since, and I'm not sure we ever will. I've been a hunter and outdoorsman my whole life, but that encounter shook my confidence in a fundamental way. There are things in the wilderness that we don't understand, things that defy our comfortable explanations. What bothers me most isn't just the creature itself, although God knows that image is burned into my memory forever, but the way it behaved, the intelligence behind those eyes, the deliberate way it followed us. It wasn't acting on instinct alone, it was thinking, deciding, and for some reason, it chose to let us leave. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced I can hear those heavy footsteps outside my bedroom window. I've installed motion lights around the house, something I never felt the need for before. Jake still has nightmares about it occasionally. I don't know what we encountered that day. I can't explain it. All I know is that my understanding of what exists in our forests has been permanently altered. There are things out there, watching from the shadows, that most people will go their whole lives without seeing, and maybe that's for the best. Story 9. I've debated whether to even share this experience for a long time. This happened when I was 14, back in 1978, and to this day, I still get a weird feeling in my stomach when I think about it. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or anything supernatural, but what I saw that day in the woods behind my house in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, has stuck with me for over 40 years now. We lived at the edge of town, where the neighborhoods gave way to woods and farmland. My parents' house was the last one on our street before the forest started. Growing up there, I knew every trail and path through those woods like the back of my hand. I'd spend most days after school exploring, building forts, or just wandering around. There was a trail that cut through the woods, past Old Man Jenkins' cornfield, then by this small dump site where people illegally tossed trash, and then into another stretch of forest that eventually came out near the highway. That particular day started off completely normal. It was late September, still warm, but with that first hint of fall in the air. School had been in session for about a month, and I remember I was wearing my favorite red flannel shirt because the mornings were getting cooler. My neighbor, Mr. Patterson, had asked if I could walk his German Shepherd Max back to his house. Max had wandered over to our place that morning, which he did sometimes, and Mr. Patterson had called asking if we'd seen him. I told him I'd bring Max home after lunch. Around 1 o'clock, I decided to take the shortcut through the woods instead of the road. The road route was about 1.5 miles, but cutting through the woods would take maybe 20 minutes tops. I'd done it hundreds of times before. Max was always good company in the woods. He was a big, well-trained dog, probably around 80 pounds, and he knew the trails as well as I did. We set off after I had my peanut butter sandwich. Max was trotting along ahead of me, happy as could be, tail wagging. We followed the main trail for about 10 minutes, then came to the clearing that bordered Jenkins' field. This clearing wasn't very big, maybe 50 feet across, and it opened up to a view of the cornfield. The corn had already been harvested, so it was just brown stubble across most of the field. At the far edge was an old barbed wire fence that separated the field from another section of woods, and near that fence was where people would sometimes dump their trash. Something changed as soon as we stepped into that clearing. Max stopped dead in his tracks. His whole demeanor shifted instantly. His ears went flat against his head, his tail dropped, and he made this low whining sound I'd never heard from him before. He backed up until he was pressing against my legs. "What's wrong, boy?" I said, looking around, thinking maybe it was a coyote or something. I didn't see anything unusual at first, just the empty field and the fence line in the distance. I tried to get Max to keep walking, but he wouldn't budge. I tugged gently on his collar, but he just pushed harder against my legs, whining softly. I tried 3 times to get him to move forward, but he was having none of it. He kept looking toward the far edge of the field, near where the fence line met the trees. That's when I finally looked more carefully in that direction. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but then I noticed movement near the fence by the dump site. Something was there, hunched down beside the fence, partially obscured by the tall weeds that grew along the fence line. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. A bear, maybe. We did have black bears in the area, but as I focused, I realized this wasn't a bear. Whatever it was covered in dark hair. Not fur, but hair. Long and matted, dark brown or almost black. It was crouched down next to the garbage pile, and it seemed to be digging through the trash. The thing that really hit me was that it was using its hand, not a paw, a hand. I could see the deliberate way it was picking through items, examining things, setting some aside. Bears don't do that. I couldn't make out its face from that distance. It was maybe 100 yards away. but I could see its massive shoulders hunched over as it sorted through the garbage. Even crouched down like that, its shoulders were level with the fence posts, which I knew were about 4 feet high. If this thing stood up, it would be huge. The clearing was dead quiet. There was just the sound of the breeze rustling the trees and some birds chirping in the distance. Max was frozen beside me, watching the creature just like I was. He wasn't barking or growling, just silently staring and trembling slightly against my leg. I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger. The thing hadn't noticed us, and it was pretty far away. But every instinct in my body was screaming that I needed to get out of there. I didn't want to wait around to see what would happen if it spotted us or decided to come our way. As quietly as I could, I turned around, keeping my eyes on the creature for a few seconds longer. Max didn't need any encouragement this time. He was already backing up, ready to leave. We retreated back into the woods, and once we were out of sight of the clearing, I started walking fast, not quite running, but moving quickly. Max stayed right by my side, which was unusual for him. He typically liked to run ahead on trails. My heart was hammering in my chest. I took the long way around, using the road instead of cutting back through the woods. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time, half expecting to see that thing following us, but there was nothing. When I got to Mr. Patterson's house, I didn't tell him what we'd seen. What would I even say? Hey, Max and I just saw a monster in the woods. I was 14, not 8. I knew how that would sound. So I just said Max had been waiting at our house, and Mr. Patterson thanked me for bringing him back. Walking home alone along the road, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear, definitely not. Bears don't sit and sort through trash with their hands. It wasn't a person either. No human is that big or covered in hair like that. The way it moved was, I don't know, deliberate, intelligent. It wasn't thrashing around like an animal would. When I got home, I didn't tell my parents either. My dad would have either thought I was making it up or would have grabbed his rifle and wanted to go looking for it, and I definitely didn't want to go back there. My mum would have just worried and probably wouldn't have let me go in the woods anymore. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure crouched by the fence, its massive shoulders, the way it was using its hands. I told myself maybe it was just a person in a weird coat or something, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The next day at school, I overheard some seniors talking about Bigfoot sightings in western Pennsylvania. My blood ran cold. I'd heard of Bigfoot before, sure. Who hadn't seen those blurry photos or that famous film clip they showed on TV sometimes? But I'd always thought it was just a made-up thing, like the Loch Ness Monster or aliens. But listening to those guys talk, describing something that sounded exactly like what I'd seen, I felt sick to my stomach. I avoided that section of the woods for weeks afterward. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I worked up the courage to go back to the clearing with my friend Tom. I didn't tell him why I wanted to check out the dump site, just that I thought someone might have thrown away some cool stuff we could salvage. We didn't find anything unusual that day, no footprints or hair, or anything that would prove what I saw. But I noticed the trash had been significantly rearranged since the last time I was there. As the years went by, I convinced myself it must have been a bear, or maybe just some homeless person wearing a heavy coat. But deep down, I know what I saw. I've watched documentaries about Sasquatch and Bigfoot since then, and the descriptions always match what I saw that day. The size, the hair, the way it moved. I'm 48 now, and I moved away from Cambria County after college. I've only been back a handful of times to visit family. Each time, I drive past the entrance to those woods, and I always get this chill up my spine. I've never gone back to that clearing or that trail. Not once in all these years. The strangest part of the whole experience wasn't even seeing the creature itself. It was Max's reaction. That dog wasn't afraid of anything. I'd seen him chase off bears and stand his ground against aggressive farm dogs twice his size. But whatever he sensed that day in the clearing terrified him into silence. Animals know things we don't. They sense things we can't, and whatever Max sensed that day, he wanted no part of it. I still don't know for sure what I saw that day in the woods. I can't explain it, can't rationalize it away completely. All I know is that it was real, it was there, and to this day the memory of those massive shoulders hunched over by that fence still keeps me from walking alone in the woods. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen, and some parts of the woods are better left unexplored. Story 10. I've been debating whether to post this for years. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it's been eating at me since the summer of 2008. I live in Clarion, Pennsylvania. It's a small town surrounded by dense forests and hills, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. I've always been into mountain biking, and I'm lucky enough to have some decent trails right behind my house that wind through the woods for miles. I've been riding those trails since I was a teenager, so I know every route, rock and turn like the back of my hand. That day in July started like any other summer day. It was hot but not unbearable, maybe 85 degrees, with that thick humidity that makes your clothes stick to you within minutes. I remember I was wearing my favorite red biking jersey, cargo shorts, and my beaten-up hiking boots because I was too stubborn to buy proper biking shoes. My wife had gone to visit her sister for the weekend, so I had the whole day to myself. I headed out around 10 in the morning. The trails were completely empty, not unusual for a weekday. Most people in town were at work, and tourists usually stuck to the more popular spots. I had the whole forest to myself, which is exactly how I liked it. About an hour into my ride, I was feeling great. That perfect zone where your legs are warm, but not tired yet. I was taking a trail that loops around the backside of Miller's Ridge, an area that's a bit more remote than the rest. The forest was thick there, lots of old oaks and maples, with a dense understory that makes it hard to see more than 20 feet into the woods in some spots. That's when I first noticed something odd. There was this heavy stomping sound coming from deeper in the forest to my right. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but it was way too heavy and deliberate. Deer kind of prance, you know? This was like thud, 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 slow and powerful. I stopped my bike and just listened. The stomping continued for maybe 15 seconds, then stopped. I figured maybe it was a bear. We get black bears around here sometimes, though they're usually pretty shy. I whistled loudly, something I'd always been told to do to avoid surprising wildlife, and continued on my way, a little faster than before. The trail started climbing up toward the top of the ridge. It's a tough section that always leaves me winded, but the view at the top makes it worth it. You can see the whole valley spread out below, including the edge of town about 2 miles away. I was about halfway up the climb when I heard it again, that same heavy stomping, but faster now, like whatever it was had picked up its pace. I pushed harder on the pedals, suddenly feeling very alone out there. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. Have you ever felt that? It's like your body knows something your brain doesn't yet. I finally reached the top of the ridge, sweating and breathing hard. I stopped at my usual spot, a small clearing that offers that perfect valley view. I took a drink from my water bottle and tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself I was being stupid. It was just a bear, or maybe a couple of deer moving together. That's when I heard it, a roar, but not like any animal I've ever heard around here. It wasn't a bear's roar or an elk bugle or anything I could identify. It was deep and rough, and I don't know how else to describe it except to say it sounded angry. It echoed through the trees and seemed to vibrate in my chest. I froze completely. Water was still dripping down my chin from my half-finished drink. I couldn't move. It was like my body just shut down. The sound had come from behind me, maybe 50 yards back in the direction I'd just come from. Slowly, I turned around, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and undergrowth. Then movement caught my eye at the edge of a dense patch of pines. That's when I saw it. Standing there, just at the edge of the tree line, was something I still have trouble describing. It was massive, standing upright on two legs, but nothing like a human. It had to be at least 9 feet tall, maybe taller, and incredibly broad. Not fat, but built like a linebacker times 3. It was covered in hair, not fur exactly, but long, shaggy hair that was a reddish-brown color, like rust mixed with dirt. The hair wasn't uniform. It had patches where it was thicker, and I could see what looked like dried leaves and dirt tangled in it. The thing that stands out most in my memory is what it was doing. It was hitting a tree with its hand or fist, just repeatedly striking at a tall pine. The tree was shaking with each impact, and I could hear the dull thud echoing across the ridge. It wasn't like it was trying to knock the tree down. It was more like, I don't know, like it was sending a message or something. When it stopped hitting the tree, it turned slightly, and that's when we made eye contact. I'll never forget those eyes as long as I live. They were blue-green, almost teal, and they caught the sunlight in a way that made them seem to glow slightly. They didn't look like animal eyes. There was something behind them, something that was thinking. Its face was partially covered in that same reddish-brown hair, but I could see skin around the eyes and mouth. The skin was weathered and dark, like old leather that's been left in the sun too long. Its jaw moved slightly, not like it was chewing, but more like it was working its mouth, maybe smelling the air or something. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. This thing, this Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, was real and standing not 50 yards from me. Then it moved. It took 2 long steps backward into the trees. Just 2 steps, but they covered so much ground. It moved with this weird fluid grace that doesn't make sense for something so large. And then it was gone. There was barely any sound as it disappeared. Just a slight rustle of undergrowth, nothing like the crashing you'd expect from something that size moving through dense forest. For several seconds, I just stood there, straddling my bike, completely stunned. Then survival instinct kicked in, and I was pedaling down the other side of the ridge like my life depended on it. I didn't follow the trail. I just bombed straight down the steepest part, nearly crashing multiple times as my tires skidded on loose dirt and rocks. I made it home in record time, threw my bike down in the yard, and locked myself in the house. I was shaking so bad I couldn't even hold my phone to call someone. Who would I call anyway? Who would believe me? It took hours for my adrenaline to wear off enough that I could think clearly. As I calmed down, something occurred to me that made the whole encounter even more disturbing. From where that thing had been standing, it could see both the trail system and the edge of town. The houses on Cedar Street would be clearly visible from that spot. It wasn't just randomly wandering, it was in a position to observe both the wilderness and civilization. And there's one more thing that I didn't register in the moment, but that came back to me later that night. The smell. There was this distinct odor in the air up there that I hadn't really processed because I was so focused on what I was seeing. It was sour and musty, like rotting vegetation mixed with something animal, like really bad body odor, but worse, more wild. Once I remembered it, I could almost taste it again in the back of my throat. I didn't go back on those trails for weeks. When I finally did, I took a different route and carried bear spray, though I'm not sure what good it would do against something that size. I've never gone back to that specific section of ridge, never will. I've spent countless hours since then researching Bigfoot sightings, looking for explanations, trying to convince myself I saw a bear standing oddly, or a person in a costume, or anything other than what I know I saw. But I can't unsee those eyes. I can't forget how it moved. No human could move like that. No costume could look so real. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear that heavy thud, thud, thud outside my window. My wife thinks I had some kind of panic attack out there in the heat. My buddy Mike suggested maybe I got dehydrated and hallucinated. I've almost convinced myself they're right. Almost. But then I remember those eyes looking at me, seeing me. recognizing me as something it knew. And I wonder, how many times had it watched me ride those trails before I finally noticed it? How many times has it watched others? How many people in this town have been observed without ever knowing? I've never seen it again. But sometimes, when I'm out in my backyard at dusk and the wind is blowing from the direction of the ridge, I catch that smell again, that wild, sour smell, and I know it's still out there watching. Story 11. I'm a grown man now, but I still get chills thinking about what happened when I was 12. It was the middle of July, 1987, the kind of summer day where the heat sticks to your skin and the only relief is finding water. My brother Joey was 10, and our cousins Sam and Tyler were visiting from Tennessee. Sam was 11 and Tyler was 9. My dad owned a small construction business about 2 miles from our house in rural Alabama. Behind his shop was this perfect little creek that cut through the woods. It was our go-to swimming spot all summer long. The water was always cool, even on the hottest days, and there was this nice sandy bank where we could dry off. That morning started like any other summer day. Mom made us all breakfast, and then we grabbed our towels and headed out. Dad was working at the shop and told us to be back before lunch. We'd done this a million times before. The walk there took about 30 minutes, down a dirt road and then through a little trail in the woods. We got to the creek around 10 in the morning. It was already blazing hot, so we immediately stripped down to our shorts and jumped in. The water felt amazing. We were splashing around, having contests to see who could hold their breath the longest, and just being normal kids. After about half an hour, I got tired of swimming and decided to stretch out on the sand to dry off. I walked about 20 yards from the creek bank and laid down, feeling the warm sand on my back and the sun on my face. Joey, Sam and Tyler were still in the water, laughing and splashing each other. I must have dozed off for a minute or two. Then I heard Joey yell something that didn't sound like playing anymore. I opened my eyes just in time to see all 3 of them sprinting past me, water still dripping off them, eyes wide with panic. "Run, Mark, run!" Joey screamed as he passed me. I didn't ask questions. Something in their faces triggered that primal fear response. I jumped up and started running after them, not even looking back at first. We all just ran, crashing through the underbrush away from the creek. After a few seconds, I couldn't help myself. I glanced back over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. Standing by a massive oak tree near the water was this thing. It was tall, way taller than my dad, who's 6'2", maybe 7 or 8 feet, and broad, like a linebacker, but bigger. The whole body was covered in dark hair or fur. Not like a bear, though. It was standing upright, leaning against the tree trunk, watching us run. I only looked for a split second before turning back and running faster than I'd ever run in my life. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Joey was ahead of me, and I could hear Sam and Tyler crashing through the bushes nearby. We ran several hundred yards through the woods until we hit this steep embankment. It was about 50 feet high and covered with pine trees. Without hesitating, we started scrambling up, grabbing onto roots and small trees to pull ourselves up. My fingers were digging into the dirt, and I scraped my knee on a rock, but I barely felt it. The only thing in my mind was getting away from whatever was back there. We finally reached the top, all 4 of us panting and shaking. Joey was crying a little, trying not to make noise. Tyler had lost one of his shoes. We crouched there for maybe 15 seconds, trying to catch our breath. That's when we heard it coming. It sounded like something huge was charging up the embankment after us. Not like a person running, more like a freight train. There was this powerful crashing sound as it pushed straight through the pine trees. Branches were snapping and the ground seemed to shake with each impact. Whatever it was coming up that hill way faster than we had. "Go!" Sam shouted, and we all scrambled over the top of the embankment and down the other side. The other side was covered in briars and vines, but we didn't care. We jumped and slid down, getting scratched up, but not slowing down. I remember the thorns tearing at my legs and arms, but the fear was so overwhelming that the pain barely registered. We ran another half-mile at least, through thick woods, before we finally stopped. All of us were bleeding from scratches, covered in dirt and gasping for air. Joey had lost his towel somewhere. I had thorns stuck in my palms from when I fell. What was that thing? Tyler kept asking between breaths. None of us had an answer. We stayed there for a long time, huddled together, listening. Eventually, when we didn't hear anything following us anymore, we decided to make our way to my dad's shop. We took the long way around, sticking to the open fields instead of going back through the woods. When we got to the shop, Dad was working on some cabinets. He took one look at us, dirty, scratched up, wide-eyed with fear, and immediately put down his tools. "What the hell happened to you boys?" he asked. We all started talking at once. Joey was crying again. Dad got us inside, gave us some water, and made us calm down and tell him one at a time. I went first, describing what I'd seen by the tree. Then Joey told his part. Joey had gotten the best look at it. He said it was massive, covered in dark brown or black hair with long arms. He said the face looked almost human, but not quite. The forehead was sloped, and the eyes were deep set. He compared it to pictures of Bigfoot or Sasquatch we'd seen in books. Sam and Tyler didn't see as much as Joey did, but they swore it wasn't a bear or a person in a costume. A bear wouldn't have chased us up that embankment the way this thing did, moving through trees like they were twigs. Dad listened to all of us, and I could tell he believed that we'd seen something that scared us, but I don't think he believed it was a Bigfoot. Still, he grabbed his shotgun from his truck and drove us back to the creek. We stayed in the truck while he walked around, looking for tracks or signs of whatever had been there. He was gone maybe 20 minutes. When he came back, he was frowning. He didn't say much, just that he didn't see anything unusual. But I noticed he kept looking back at the woods as we drove home, and he didn't put his shotgun away when we got back to the house. He decided not to call the police. In our small town, saying you saw a Bigfoot would have made us the laughingstock for years. But he did tell us to stay away from the creek for the rest of the summer. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure leaning against the tree, watching us, and the sound of it charging up that hill behind us. I kept jerking awake, thinking I heard branches breaking outside my window. Joey ended up sleeping in my room that night. He kept whispering, "It was real, right? You saw it too?" I'd nod, and we'd go quiet again, listening to every little sound outside. The next day, Dad went back to the area with his friend Bill, who was an experienced hunter. They spent most of the day out there. When they came back, they were talking in low voices on the porch. I tried to eavesdrop, but all I caught was Dad saying, "I don't know what to make of it," and Bill responding, "I've hunted these woods for 30 years and never seen tracks like that." They never told us what they found, if anything. Dad just reinforced that we needed to stay away from there. Sam and Tyler went back to Tennessee a few days later. We promised to keep in touch about what happened, but we never really talked about it again in detail. It was like we all wanted to forget. But I couldn't forget. For months after, I had nightmares. I stopped going into the woods altogether. Even now, 36 years later, I get uncomfortable in dense forests, especially if I'm alone. I've read a lot about Bigfoot encounters since then, trying to make sense of what we saw. Some accounts sound eerily similar to our experience. The height, the speed, the strength. But I've never publicly shared our story until now. Joey and I have talked about it a few times as adults. He's still convinced it was a Sasquatch. Sam says the same thing when we get together at family reunions. Tyler is the only one who tries to rationalize it as maybe a bear or even some homeless guy living in the woods. But I can tell he doesn't really believe that. The thing that still haunts me isn't just what it looked like, but how it moved. The way it came up that steep embankment, pushing through pine trees like they were nothing. No human could do that, and no bear moves quite like that either. Dad sold his business 2 years later and we moved to another town. I've never been back to that creek, and I never will. Whatever was there that day was real. 4 kids don't imagine the same thing and don't all feel the same terror without reason. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I still hear that sound. The crashing of something impossibly strong moving through the woods behind me, and I wonder if it's still out there in those Alabama woods, leaning against trees and watching people who don't know they're being watched. Story 12. I've been hesitating to share this for so long. Even now at my age, I worry people will think I'm crazy or making it up. But I need to tell someone about what happened back in Morris Valley when I was a little girl. It's been weighing on me for over 80 years. This was back in 1932. I was 8 years old, and we lived in a small cabin near Little Mystery Mountain in British Columbia. Times were tough. The Depression hit us hard. My father worked whatever jobs he could find, usually logging or odd jobs for farmers. My mother took in laundry and mending. With 7 children to feed, there was never enough of anything to go around. I was the 3rd youngest. My sister Lucy was just a year older than me. Being poor meant we didn't have toys like some children, but we had the whole outdoors as our playground. We spent almost every day exploring the woods, meadows, and the small lake about a quarter-mile from our house. Our parents were too busy trying to keep food on the table to worry much about where we wandered, as long as we were home by supper. It was early June when we first met him. Lucy and I were picking wild berries on the lower slopes of Mystery Mountain. I remember my fingers were stained purple, and I had more berries in my stomach than in my pail. The sun was warm on my back, and we were singing some silly song we'd made up. That's when I noticed something moving in the bushes about 20 feet away. At first I thought it was a bear cub, and my heart nearly stopped. Mother had warned us about bears with cubs, how dangerous they could be. I grabbed Lucy's arm and pointed. We both froze, but it wasn't a bear. It was, well, I still don't know exactly what it was. A small figure, maybe 3.5 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, stood watching us. It looked like a very dirty, very hairy child. "Hello?" Lucy called out, always braver than me. The creature didn't run away. Instead, it took a few steps toward us, moving in a strange, shuffling way. It had a flat, wide face with deep-set eyes that looked surprisingly human. Its nose was broad and flat, and I could see small teeth when it opened its mouth. "Play," it said, in a high, raspy voice that made my skin prickle. Lucy and I looked at each other, wide-eyed. The creature, which we later named Onsag, wasn't threatening. If anything, it seemed curious and maybe a little lonely. That first day, we just watched each other from a distance. Onsag would take a few steps closer, then retreat, almost like a game. Eventually, we had to go home, but we promised to return the next day, though I'm not sure if Onsag understood us. True to our word, we went back to the same spot the following afternoon. Onsag was waiting, sitting on a fallen log, picking at something on the ground. This time, when we approached, he didn't back away. "Play now?" he asked, pointing at our jump rope. I can't explain why we weren't more afraid. Maybe children accept strange things more easily than adults. Or maybe there was something about Onsag that felt safe, despite his odd appearance. Lucy handed him one end of the jump rope, and we taught him how to turn it while I jumped. Onsag learned quickly. His hands were surprisingly dexterous, with long fingers and thick, tough nails that looked more like claws. That day marked the beginning of our strange friendship, one that would last for several summers. We met Onsag almost every day that summer. He never came to our regular meeting spot if anyone else was with us, just Lucy and me. He seemed to know somehow if our brothers were tagging along, and on those days, he wouldn't appear. Onsag rarely spoke, and when he did, it was never more than 3 words strung together. "Play tag now." "Water fun, yes. Berries good eat." His voice always sounded like he had a sore throat, raspy and low. He loved games. Tag was his favorite, and goodness, he was fast. We could never catch him unless he let us. He'd dart between trees and over rocks like they weren't even there. His feet were tough as leather, he never wore shoes, and thorns and sharp rocks didn't seem to bother him at all. I remember one time I got a terrible splinter in my foot, and while I sat crying, trying to pull it out, Onsag watched me with this confused expression, like he couldn't understand why such a small thing would hurt. By midsummer, we'd grown comfortable enough with each other that Onsag led us to the place where he lived during the warm months. It was high up on Mystery Mountain, a series of rocky outcroppings that formed small cave-like shelters. He seemed to live there with others of his kind, though we rarely saw them clearly, just glimpses of movement and sometimes eyes watching us from the shadows of the rocks. One day in late July, our older brothers insisted on following us. Tommy was 13 and John was 11, and they'd grown suspicious of where Lucy and I disappeared to every day. We tried to lose them, but they were determined. "We know you're hiding something," Tommy said, "and we're going to find out what it is." When we reached our usual meeting place, Onsag wasn't there. I thought we were safe, but then we heard a rustling from the tall grass nearby. Before we could stop him, Tommy ran over and parted the grass. Onsag was crouched there, looking scared. He made a strange, high-pitched whining sound when he saw our brothers. "What the heck is that?" John shouted, jumping back. Tommy, trying to act brave, picked up a stick. "Is it some kind of monkey? Did it escape from somewhere?" "Don't hurt him!" I screamed, running to stand between Tommy and Onsag. "He's our friend." Onsag darted away faster than any of us could follow, disappearing into the woods. Tommy and John stood there, mouths hanging open. "That thing is your friend?" Tommy finally asked. "Does Mom know about this?" Of course, we hadn't told our parents. We knew they wouldn't understand. Adults rarely did. For 3 days after that, Onsag didn't come to our meeting place. When he finally returned, he seemed wary, constantly looking around as if expecting our brothers to jump out at any moment. "Bad boys come?" he asked, his dark eyes scanning the woods behind us. "No," Lucy assured him, "just us today." To our surprise, Tommy and John didn't tell our parents about Onsag. I think they were afraid they wouldn't be believed, or worse, would be accused of making up stories. Instead, they demanded to be included in our adventures with Onsag. At first, Onsag was terrified of our brothers, but after a few tense meetings, something unexpected happened. Tommy suggested a game of kickball, using an old rubber ball he'd salvaged from somewhere. Onsag watched for a while, then joined in. To everyone's shock, especially Tommy's, Onsag was incredible at kickball. He could kick the ball farther than any of us and run bases faster than even Tommy, who was the fastest runner in his class at school. I still remember the look on Tommy's face the first time Onsag outran him, a mixture of awe and annoyance that made Lucy and me giggle until our sides hurt. As summer turned to fall, we learned more about Onsag. He showed us which berries were safe to eat and which mushrooms to avoid. He could catch fish with his bare hands, slipping them into the shallow parts of the lake and staying perfectly still until he made a lightning-quick grab. He taught us to move quietly through the woods, though we never matched his silent footsteps. When the weather grew colder, Onsag explained in his broken way that he and his family would be moving to their winter home. "Go down deep," he said, pointing to the ground. "Warm there." From what we could gather, they lived in some sort of underground cavern or well during the winter months. He promised to return when the big snow gone, making a melting motion with his hands. True to his word, Onsag reappeared the following spring, and our unusual friendship continued. By then, we'd grown so accustomed to his strange appearance that we hardly noticed it anymore. To us, he was just Onsag, our wild, hairy friend who couldn't speak properly and moved too fast for us to keep up. The summer of 1934 was particularly memorable. That was the year Onsag first came to our house. It was Christmas time, and a heavy snow had fallen. We hadn't seen him in months and assumed he was in his winter home. But on Christmas Eve, as our family sat around our small fire opening the few modest presents we had, there was a scratching at the window. Lucy saw him first, a hairy face peering in through the frosted glass, illuminated by the firelight. She gasped, causing everyone to turn. "It's Onsag!" she exclaimed. Our parents had heard stories about our wild friend, but had dismissed them as childish imagination. Now, faced with the reality, our mother nearly fainted. Father, surprisingly, was the calmest. "Well," he said, looking at Onsag's shivering form outside the window, "it's Christmas. Invite your friend in." I remember how awkward Onsag looked in our small cabin. He hunched his shoulders, clearly uncomfortable with the ceiling so close above him. He sniffed at everything. The pine decorations, the candles, even the wrapped presents. The heat from the fire seemed to bother him, making him sweat visibly through his hair. Mother, recovering from her shock, offered him hot cocoa, which he sniffed suspiciously before taking a tiny sip. His face scrunched up immediately, and he handed the mug back, shaking his head vigorously. "No hot," he said firmly. What he did enjoy, though, were the saltine crackers with butter that Mother offered next. He licked the butter off each cracker meticulously before crunching the saltine between his teeth, making pleased humming sounds. That Christmas visit became something of a tradition over the next few years. Onsag would appear on Christmas Eve, stay for a short while, never seeming comfortable inside, and then disappear back into the snowy night, often with a handful of saltines clutched in his hairy fingers. One of my fondest memories is of teaching Onsag to play Ring Around the Rosie. He loved the spinning and the falling down part especially. His laughter was so strange, like a series of high-pitched hoots that made us all join in. Sometimes he would sing along in his raspy voice, getting most of the words wrong, but enthusiastically participating nonetheless. But not all memories are happy ones. The summer of 1938 was when everything changed. I was 14 by then, and Lucy was 15. We still played with Onsag sometimes, though not as often as when we were younger. One hot August day, Mother was particularly stressed. The garden wasn't doing well due to a dry spell, and her precious tomato plants were struggling to produce. Onsag had been hanging around the edge of our yard all morning, watching Mother work. Without warning, he suddenly darted across the yard and into our kitchen through the open back door. This wasn't entirely unusual. By then, he occasionally came inside for brief visits. But this time, before anyone could stop him, he lifted his loincloth-like covering and relieved himself right on our kitchen floor. Mother came in just in time to witness this. Her face turned bright red. "What in heaven's name?" she shouted. Onsag, not seeming to understand her anger, grinned and darted back outside. Mother grabbed her broom and followed, still shouting. Lucy and I ran after them, worried about what might happen. Outside, Onsag had moved to Mother's vegetable garden. In what I think was an attempt to please her after seeing her anger, he was picking tomatoes. But he was doing it all wrong, pulling entire plants up by their roots and stripping the vines. Mother's precious tomato plants, which she'd nursed through the dry spell, were being destroyed before her eyes. Something in her snapped. She swung the broom with all her might, catching Onsag across the back. He made a sound I'd never heard before, a high, keening wail that raised the hair on my arms. Then he dropped the mangled tomato plants and ran, faster than I'd ever seen him move, straight into the forest. "Good riddance," Mother shouted after him, still clutching her broom, her chest heaving with anger. Lucy and I were horrified. We called for Onsag every day for weeks after that, but he never came back. Sometimes, high on Mystery Mountain, we thought we could see dark figures moving among the rocks, watching us. But Onsag never again came close enough for us to speak to him. By the next summer, our family had moved away from Morris Valley, forced to relocate for Father's new job at a sawmill 50 miles away. I often wonder if Onsag came looking for us after we left, finding only strangers in our old cabin. All these years later, I still think about him. What was he? Some kind of wild child raised by animals? A species unknown to science? Whatever Onsag was, he was my friend, and I miss him still. Sometimes when I'm half asleep, I can almost hear his raspy voice calling me to play tag, or his strange hooting laughter as we spin in circles, playing Ring Around the Rosie in a sun-dappled clearing, the warm summer air filled with the scent of pine and wild berries. And I wonder if somewhere out there, an old hairy creature remembers a little girl who taught him to jump rope and gave him butter on saltines. Story 13. I've never posted anything like this before, but I need to get this off my chest. I'm still struggling to make sense of what happened to me last October outside of Forks, Washington. I've been an EMT for 11 years and was a firefighter for 7 years before that. I've seen some messed up shit in my time, car wrecks, house fires, people in their worst moments, but nothing prepared me for what happened at that cabin. I've always been the rational guy, the one who doesn't jump to conclusions. My training taught me to assess situations logically, to look for explanations, to stay calm when everything's going to hell. But what happened that night, I just can't explain it. My buddy Colin and I have been hunting together for years. We've got this cabin we rent every October. Nothing fancy, just a basic structure with a couple of beds, a small kitchen, and a living area with a wood stove. It's about 20 miles outside of Forks, down these logging roads that get progressively worse the deeper you go. No electricity, just a generator we run sparingly, and the nearest neighbor is miles away. We love it specifically because it's so isolated. This was our 5th year heading out there. We arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, planning to stay until Sunday. The first day and a half were completely normal. We got some hunting in, saw a few deer but nothing worth taking, drank some beers around the fire at night, typical guy stuff. The weird shit started on Thursday. Colin realized we were low on propane and some other supplies, so he decided to make a run into Forks. It was about 2 in the afternoon when he left. I remember checking my watch because I figured he'd be back before dark if he hustled. I decided to use the alone time to hike a ridge about a mile from the cabin that we hadn't explored yet. I grabbed my rifle, some water, and headed out. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, overcast but not raining. Classic Pacific Northwest October. I spent about 2 hours up on that ridge, scouting game trails and just enjoying the silence. Didn't see much, but I wasn't really expecting to. Sometimes it's just nice to be out there, you know. I started heading back around 4:30, wanting to get to the cabin before it got dark. The forest changes when the sun starts going down. Shadows get longer, sounds carry differently. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows what I'm talking about. I made it back to the cabin just as the light was really starting to fade. Colin wasn't back yet, which wasn't shocking. The trip to town and back would take at least 3 hours, and he was probably grabbing a burger or something while he was there. I fired up the generator for a bit, got some lights on, and started prepping dinner. Simple stuff, just heating up some chili we'd brought. I figured Colin would be back soon, and we'd eat together. It was fully dark by 6, and that's when I heard the first knock. It was loud, really loud, like someone taking a baseball bat and just wham, hitting a tree. It came from the forest behind the cabin, maybe 100 yards back. My first thought was that Colin was back and messing with me, but his truck wasn't in the drive, and besides, the sound came from the opposite direction of the road. I stepped outside onto the small back porch, flashlight in hand. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small in the darkness. The forest was dead quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing, just silence. I swept the flashlight across the tree line. Nothing moved. As I turned to go back inside, another knock came, then another, then 3 in rapid succession. Wham! 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 They were coming from different directions now, like whatever was making the sound was moving. "Who's there?" I shouted, louder this time. Part of me was getting pissed, thinking it might be locals messing with the out-of-towner. But another part, the part that spent enough time in the wilderness to develop some instincts, was getting seriously concerned. I went back inside and grabbed my rifle, not because I planned to shoot anything, but because having it made me feel better. I'm not ashamed to admit that. Something felt wrong. I decided to stay inside and wait for Colin. The knocking continued on and off for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe it was just a weird forest sound I wasn't familiar with. Maybe a falling branch hitting other trees on the way down or something. I know how the mind can play tricks when you're alone in the woods. Then the gravel started hitting the roof. Our cabin has a tin roof. When rain hits it, it makes this pleasant patter. This wasn't rain. This was like someone was grabbing handfuls of gravel and throwing them onto the roof. Plink, 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 plink. I knew it wasn't raining because I could see stars through the window, and it wasn't hail. It was too irregular, too deliberate, and it kept changing locations like whatever was throwing it was walking around the cabin. My heart was pounding now. I checked my phone. No service, of course. The cabin doesn't have a landline. I was completely cut off. Then the wall next to the kitchen shook like something had slammed into it. Hard. The plates in the cabinet rattled. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Wham! Another hit, this time on the wall near the front door. Whatever it was circling the cabin, and it was strong. Each impact made the whole structure shake. I killed the lights and moved to the window, staying to the side so I wouldn't be silhouetted. I peered out into the darkness. The moon was providing just enough light to see the clearing around the cabin. That's when I saw it, a massive dark shape moving along the edge of the clearing. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with this weird fluid grace that didn't seem right. It didn't move like a bear or any animal I recognized. My mouth went dry. Every hair on my body stood up. That primal, deep in your DNA fear just washed over me. I know it sounds dramatic, but in that moment I felt like prey. The shape disappeared into the trees, and for a second I thought maybe it was leaving. Then wham! The back wall of the cabin shook so hard, a picture fell off and the glass shattered. I backed away from the window, rifle ready, and positioned myself where I could see both the front and back doors. My hands were shaking. I'm not too proud to admit I was terrified. For the next hour, it circled the cabin, hitting different walls, sometimes so hard I thought they might cave in. It was like it was testing the structure, looking for weakness. I kept moving from window to window, trying to keep track of it, but it was fast, faster than anything that size should be. At one point, I caught a glimpse of it at the window, just this massive dark shape blocking out the stars. I swear to God it was looking in at me. I couldn't make out features, it was too dark, but I felt its eyes on me. I almost fired then, my finger was on the trigger, but something stopped me. Some instinct told me that shooting would make things worse. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I heard the blessed sound of Colin's truck coming up the drive. The headlights swept across the clearing as he pulled up. The thing, whatever it was, moved away from the cabin. I saw its silhouette cross the clearing and disappear into the trees on the far side. I ran to the door, flung it open, and shouted for Colin to get inside fast. He must have heard the panic in my voice because he grabbed the supplies and ran for the door. "What the fuck is going on?" he asked as soon as he was inside. I locked the door behind him. I told him everything while he stood there, eyes getting wider and wider. Colin's no pushover, ex-military, been hunting since he was a kid, but I could see he was shaken by what I was saying. "You think it was a bear?" he asked, but there wasn't much conviction in his voice. "No way," I said. "Bears don't throw rocks. They don't circle a cabin for an hour testing the walls, and they sure as hell don't look in windows." We decided to fire some warning shots, thinking the noise might scare whatever it was away for good. Colin grabbed his .45 and we stepped out onto the front porch. We fired 3 shots into the air, the sound echoing through the forest. The woods went dead silent after that. No knocking, no movement, nothing. We went back inside, double-checked all the locks and kept our weapons close. Around 2 in the morning we heard it again, wood knocking in the distance, then closer, then right at the edge of the clearing. We fired 2 more warning shots from inside the cabin. The knocking stopped. Neither of us slept. We kept the lights off and took turns watching the windows. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night, but I've never been so grateful to see the sun come up. In the morning light, we cautiously went outside to check around the cabin. That's when we found it, one of our spent .45 casings standing upright on the hood of Colin's truck, standing perfectly on end, like it had been carefully placed there. We looked at each other, and I knew we were thinking the same thing. That casing hadn't landed that way by accident. Something had picked it up and deliberately placed it there, something intelligent enough to send a message. We packed up and left that day, didn't even discuss it, just threw our stuff in the truck and got the hell out of there. On the drive back, Colin admitted he'd had a strange experience the previous year when he'd gone up to the cabin alone for a weekend. He'd heard similar knocking, but convinced himself it was just the wind or falling branches. He hadn't told me because he thought I'd think he was crazy. I've spent months trying to rationalize what happened. I've researched every animal native to the Olympic Peninsula. I've looked into whether teenagers or locals might be pranking hunters. Nothing fits. Nothing explains what circled our cabin that night. We still go hunting, but we haven't been back to that cabin. I don't think we ever will. Some places you just know you're not welcome. And whatever was in those woods that night made it crystal clear we weren't welcome there. I still don't sleep well. Sometimes I wake up thinking I hear knocking in the distance, and every time I'm in the woods now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Story 14. I've kept this to myself for over 20 years now, and honestly, I'm still not sure if sharing it is the right thing to do. But I need to get this off my chest, and I figure this is the safest place to do it without being called crazy to my face. This happened back in January of 2002 when I was 15. I was living in Pickens, South Carolina at the time. If you know anything about South Carolina, you know we don't get much snow, maybe a dusting every few years that melts by noon. But that January, we got hit with this freak snowstorm that dumped about 8 inches overnight. For us, that was basically the apocalypse. I had a job at this little fast food place called Burger Basket. Not one of the big chains, just a local spot where I worked the register after school and on weekends. That day, I was supposed to work till 9, and normally my dad would pick me up, but he called the store around 7 and told me he couldn't get his car out of our driveway. The roads were a mess, no plows because the county only has like 2 of them, and everyone was just staying put. My manager, this guy named Dave, he closed early at 8 because nobody was coming in anyway. He offered me a ride, but he lived in the opposite direction, and with the roads being so bad, I told him I'd just walk. It was only about 1.5 miles, and I figured the snow had stopped, so how bad could it be? Dave looked worried, but didn't argue. "Just stay on the main roads," he told me as he locked up. I nodded, but I already knew I wasn't going to do that. The main route would have added another ½ mile at least, and it was freaking cold. I had this shortcut I sometimes took when the weather was nice, this stretch of woods behind Pearson's Hardware that cut straight to my neighborhood. So I start walking, and it's so quiet with all that snow. The streetlights were making everything glow this weird orange color, and my feet were already soaked because I just had these cheap sneakers on. Nobody in South Carolina owns snow boots, you know. When I got to Pearson's, I stood there for a minute debating. The shortcut would save me at least 20 minutes, but it meant going through about 1/4 mile of woods with no lights. But I was freezing, my socks were wet, and I just wanted to get home, so I decided to risk it. The snow in the woods was untouched, like literally nobody had walked through there since it fell. It was up past my ankles, and I remember thinking how weird it was to see these familiar woods all transformed. There's usually this little creek that runs through a shallow ravine, maybe 6 feet deep and 15 feet wide, but with all the snow, I could barely make out where it was. I was about halfway through the woods when I noticed something moving down in that ravine area. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or something, but the movement was all wrong. I stopped dead in my tracks and just stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was this, I don't even know what to call it, a creature? It was down in that shallow ravine where the creek usually runs, and it was playing in the snow. I'm not making this up. It was rolling around like a kid might do, except it was definitely not a kid. This thing was about 5 feet tall, with this thick middle, not fat exactly, but solid and wide, and it was covered in this dark black hair, not fur like a bear, but hair, longer and shaggier. It would scoop up snow with these long arms, toss it up in the air, and then roll onto its side before pushing itself back up to do it again. I just stood there, frozen. I was only about 30 yards away, with nothing but open snow between us. There was no place to hide, so I just didn't move. I was terrified it would see me. The crazy thing is, I could hear it. Like, I could hear these loud huffs of breath when it would bend down close to the ground. The sound carried in that weird way sounds do when everything's covered in snow. When it turned at one point, I caught glimpses of its chest and face beneath all that tangled hair. The face wasn't exactly human, but it wasn't animal either. It had this flat nose and deep-set eyes. I couldn't make out too many details because of the distance and the hair, but what I saw was enough to make my blood run cold. I remember thinking, this can't be real. I'm seeing things. But I wasn't. This was solid and real and right in front of me. I knew exactly what it looked like. A young Sasquatch, a freaking Bigfoot, in Pickens, South Carolina, playing in the snow like it was having the time of its life. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure it would hear it. I didn't dare move for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple minutes. Then I started to think about how I was going to get out of there. I couldn't go back. That would mean another 40 minutes in the cold, taking the long way. But going forward meant potentially getting closer to this thing. I decided to try to time my movements with when it was distracted. When it would roll onto its side or throw snow in the air, I'd take 1 or 2 very slow, deliberate steps. Then I'd freeze again when it was still. I kept my eyes locked on it the whole time, watching for any sign that it had noticed me. It took forever to move just a few yards, but eventually I made it to this stand of pine trees that gave me a little cover. Once I was behind them, I didn't hesitate. I just ran. I sprinted through that snow as fast as I could, my feet breaking through the crust and sinking in with every step. My lungs burned from the cold air, and I kept slipping and catching myself. But I didn't look back. Not once. I didn't stop running until I hit the first streetlight at the edge of my neighborhood. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for breath, and finally looked back toward the woods. Nothing was following me. There was just darkness and snow. When I got home, my dad's car was still buried in the driveway, just like he'd said. I went inside, soaking wet and shivering, and he asked me if I'd walked all the way home. I just nodded. He fussed at me for not calling him again. He said he would have tried harder to get the car out, but I couldn't tell him why I was so shaken up. I just said I was cold and went to take a hot shower. I didn't tell anyone what I saw, not my parents, not my friends. Nobody, because who would believe me? Bigfoot in South Carolina, in the middle of a snowstorm. They'd think I was crazy or making it up for attention. But I know what I saw. That wasn't a bear. It wasn't a guy in a costume. Who would be out in the woods in a costume during a snowstorm? The way it moved was too fluid, too natural. And those sounds it made, those huffing breaths, I still hear them sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. The weird thing is, after that night, I became obsessed with researching Bigfoot sightings. I'd sneak books from the library and spend hours online reading accounts. I found out there have been other sightings in the Appalachian region, even in South Carolina. Though they're rare, most people think Bigfoot is this Pacific Northwest thing, but there are stories all over. What struck me was how many accounts described them as curious or even playful, not the monster that's going to chase you down and eat you like in the movies. Just this creature living its life in the woods, mostly avoiding humans. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was some weird optical illusion caused by the snow and the dim light. But deep down, I know exactly what I saw. I saw a young Sasquatch playing in the snow during what was probably a rare treat for it, just like it was for us South Carolina kids who hardly ever got to experience a real snowfall. I've never gone back to those woods alone. I actually avoided that shortcut for the rest of high school, even in broad daylight. I'm 36 now and I've moved away from Pickens, but I still think about that night whenever it snows. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it, if that creature is still out there, or if there are more of them. I wonder if it even remembers seeing me, this terrified teenager frozen in place watching it play. Or maybe it never saw me at all. I don't have proof. No pictures. This was 2002. I didn't have a camera phone. No footprints I could show anyone. Nothing but my memory. But it's burned into my brain as clearly as anything I've ever experienced. I know what I saw. So that's my story. Take it however you want. I'm not trying to convince anyone, and I'm not looking to become some Bigfoot hunter or get on one of those TV shows. I just needed to finally tell someone after keeping it bottled up all these years. To this day, I still can't explain why a Bigfoot would be in Pickens, South Carolina, or why it chose that snowstorm to come out and play. All I know is what I saw, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Story 15. I never really believed in Bigfoot. I mean, who does? It's one of those things you joke about around campfires, right? At least, that's what I thought until June 19th, 2007. I remember the date because it was 3 days after Father's Day, and we'd just had my in-laws over that weekend. They'd finally gone home, and I was enjoying the quiet of our property again. We live on about 30 acres outside Thomasville, Alabama. It's not much by some standards, but it's peaceful and private, mostly wooded with a gravel road that loops around the property. I walk it almost every day with my dog Sadie, a chocolate lab mix I've had since she was a puppy. She's the sweetest thing, but she's also protective. Always has been. That day started like any other. It was warm, but not yet the suffocating heat that Alabama summers are known for. I decided to take Sadie for our usual afternoon walk around 4 o'clock. My husband Mike was busy fixing something in the garage, the lawnmower, I think, and said he'd start dinner when I got back. The first half of our walk was completely normal. Sadie was doing her thing, sniffing everything, occasionally pulling on the leash when she caught an interesting scent. The birds were singing. Cicadas were making that constant background noise they always do in summer. Everything felt right until it didn't. We were on the back part of the loop, the farthest point from our house, when I first heard it. A knocking sound, like someone taking a piece of wood and hitting it against a tree trunk. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct sounds, evenly spaced. I stopped walking. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe it was one of our neighbors, though that would be unusual. Our nearest neighbor is almost a mile away. No response, just silence. Even the birds had gone quiet, which I only realized in that moment. "Come on, Sadie," I said, tugging gently on her leash. We continued walking, but I picked up the pace a little. Then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it seemed to come from a slightly different direction, like whatever was making the sound had moved. "Is someone there?" I called again, louder this time. Nothing. That's when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. You know that feeling, right? When the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and you just know someone's eyes are on you. It was like that, but 10 times stronger, like something was boring holes into my back with its gaze. Sadie felt it too. Her ears perked up, and she stopped pulling ahead of me. Instead, she moved closer to my side, her body tense. She wasn't growling, but her tail wasn't wagging either. She was on alert. I tried to tell myself I was being silly. It was probably just a woodpecker or something normal, but deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. The knocks were too deliberate, too even, and they were loud, not like a small bird pecking at bark. We kept walking faster now. I wanted to get back to the house, back to Mike. That's when it happened. A rock, about the size of a softball, came flying out of the woods to my right. It landed on the gravel road with a loud crack, barely missing me by maybe a foot. My heart jumped into my throat. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a natural occurrence. Someone or something had thrown that rock. "Hello," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "This isn't funny." I was thinking maybe some kids were playing a prank, though we don't have many neighbors with children, and our property is pretty clearly marked with no trespassing signs. I started walking even faster, almost jogging now, pulling Sadie along with me. Another rock landed, this one even closer than the first. It hit the ground and rolled, stopping against my shoe. Now I was scared, really scared. My hands were shaking and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. We were approaching a bend in the road where it curves around a deep hollow before heading back toward the house. I just needed to get around that bend, and we'd be on the home stretch. As we reached the curve, something made me look up toward the hollow. I don't know if it was a sound or movement or just that overwhelming feeling of being watched, but I looked up, and there it was. Standing at the edge of the trees, partially obscured by the foliage but unmistakably there, was, I don't even know how to describe it, a creature, a being, not human, not any animal I've ever seen. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was thick and muscular, with shoulders twice as broad as a normal man's. It was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, not fur exactly, more like hair. Long, matted hair that hung down from its arms, which were unnaturally long, reaching almost to its knees. But its face, God, its face is what I'll never forget. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't completely animal either. The eyes were deep set under a prominent brow ridge, and they were staring directly at me. Intelligent eyes, knowing eyes. Not the vacant stare of an animal, but something that understood exactly what it was looking at. For a moment, probably only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. We just stared at each other. Me, frozen in terror on the gravel road, and this Bigfoot, standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods. Then it did something that turned my blood to ice. It opened its mouth and made a sound. It started as a low growl, deep and rumbling like distant thunder. But it grew in intensity until it became a scream. Not human, not animal, something else entirely. It echoed through the trees and seemed to vibrate in my chest. Sadie yelped, a sound of pure terror I'd never heard her make before, and took off running, yanking the leash so hard it burned my palm as it pulled through my grip. But I didn't care about the pain. My body finally unfroze, and I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I don't remember the rest of that walk back. It's a blur of gravel crunching under my feet, branches whipping past, and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Sadie was ahead of me the whole time, the leash trailing behind her. All I knew was that I had to get back to the house, back to safety. When I burst through our back door, Mike looked up from the kitchen counter where he was chopping vegetables, his face immediately changing from surprise to concern. "What happened? Are you okay?" he asked, putting down the knife and coming toward me. I was bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. Sadie had run straight to her bed in the corner and was curled up tight, still trembling. Something out there, I managed between gasps. Big, not human, threw rocks at me. Mike probably thought I was crazy. I would have thought I was crazy too if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But he knows me, knows I'm not one for dramatics or making up stories. He could see the genuine terror in my face. "Stay here," he said, grabbing his shotgun from the cabinet. "Lock the door behind me." "No!" I grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there, please." The thought of him encountering that thing alone made my stomach turn. He hesitated, looking at my face, then at Sadie, still cowering in her bed. "Okay," he said finally, "but we should call someone." "Who do you call when you've seen a Bigfoot? The police would think we were pranking them. Game wardens deal with known animals, not whatever this was. In the end, we didn't call anyone. We just locked all the doors and windows and stayed inside for the rest of the evening. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent, knowing eyes staring back at me. I heard that sound, that growl that turned into a scream, echoing in my head. 3 days later, when Mike had convinced me it was safe, we went back to the spot where I'd seen the creature. I was terrified, but also needed some kind of confirmation that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Mike brought his gun, and we went in the middle of the day when the sun was high. There, at the edge of the trees where I'd seen it standing, was a footprint, a single massive footprint pressed deep into the soft dirt. It was huge, at least 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes spread wide apart. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was incredibly heavy. Mike put his boot next to it for comparison, and the print dwarfed his size 11 shoe. We took pictures, though they don't really show the depth or the detail we could see in person. Mike made a cast of it using some plaster he had left over from a home project. That cast is still in our garage, wrapped in an old towel and tucked away on a high shelf. I don't like looking at it. It's been over 15 years now, and I've never walked that back loop again. Mike still does occasionally, always with his gun, but he's never seen anything unusual. Sometimes, though, he says he gets that feeling, that sensation of being watched. When that happens, he turns around and comes straight home. I've researched Bigfoot sightings since then, read countless accounts from other people who claim to have seen similar creatures. Some sound crazy, but others sound just like what happened to me. The rock throwing, the knocking sounds, the screams. It's all consistent with what others have reported. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know if Bigfoot is even the right term for it. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and for some reason it wanted me to know it was there. It could have remained hidden, could have watched me walk by none the wiser. But it chose to make itself known. To this day, I don't understand why. Sometimes when I'm home alone and it's quiet, I swear I can hear knocking in the distance. Knock, knock, knock. When that happens, I close all the blinds, call Sadie to my side, and wait for Mike to come home. Because I know now that there are things in this world that can't be explained, things that exist in the shadows of our understanding. And sometimes they're watching story 16. Deceit. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my family. It happened back in the summer of 2006 when I was 9 years old. We lived out in the countryside in Okala County, and our house was pretty isolated, with woods stretching behind our property for miles. There were 5 of us boys, me, Jay, my older brothers Tom and Mikey, and my younger brothers Dee and Sammy. Our parents worked a lot, so we mostly entertained ourselves, which meant exploring the woods almost every day. That summer was particularly hot, the kind of heat that makes the air feel thick and makes everything move in slow motion. We knew those woods like the back of our hands, every trail, every tree fort spot, and especially the small spring about a quarter mile in. That was our favorite place to play. It had cool, clear water and some rocks we could jump from, perfect for hot days. On this particular day, man, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. We'd been at the spring most of the afternoon. It must have been around 7:30 or maybe 8 in the evening when we decided to head back home for dinner. Mom had a rule about being home before dark, and the sun was already starting to dip. "Let's go," Tom said, being the oldest at 12. "Mom's gonna be mad if we're late again." I remember Dee, who was only 6 at the time, begging to stay a little longer. "5 more minutes, please," he kept saying. Tom finally gave in, but told the rest of us to start heading back. "I'll wait for Dee," he said, but then changed his mind when Mikey found a snapping turtle near the path. Tom couldn't resist checking it out, so he told Dee to catch up in a minute. We were maybe 100 yards from the spring when we heard it. Screaming, not like playing around screaming, but genuine terror. It was Dee, and he was running toward us faster than I'd ever seen him move, his face white as a sheet. "Monster!" he was screaming. "Hairy monster back there!" Tom grabbed him by the shoulders when he reached us. "What are you talking about? Stop crying!" Dee was hysterical, pointing back toward the spring. "It's back there, big, hairy, it was watching me." I remember looking at my brothers' faces and seeing that mix of disbelief and concern. We all knew Dee had a big imagination, but he wasn't the type to make up stories like this. He was genuinely terrified. "Probably just a bear," Mikey said, but he didn't sound convinced. Tom squared his shoulders, trying to look brave. "Let's go check it out." Looking back, that was probably a stupid decision, but we were kids and curious. Plus, there were 5 of us, so we felt some safety in numbers. We started back toward the spring, with Dee reluctantly following behind, still whimpering. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows through the trees. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Usually the woods were full of bird sounds and rustling, but it was like everything had gone still. That should have been our first warning. We approached the spring cautiously. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the small pool of water, the rocks we'd been jumping from, our towels still draped over a fallen log. But then we heard it, movement in the brush about 20 yards beyond the spring, not the light movement of a squirrel or raccoon, but heavy, deliberate, sticks snapping under significant weight. "There," Dee whispered, pointing with a shaking finger. We all froze, straining to see. The brush was thick in that area, lots of mountain laurel and dense undergrowth, but something was definitely moving in there. I could see the bushes swaying, branches being pushed aside, and then I saw it. We all did. About 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a thicket, was something. Even now, 16 years later, I struggle to describe it precisely. It was crouched down, one arm, and I say arm because it wasn't a paw, pressed against the ground, the other holding onto a branch of the thicket. It was covered in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, but hair, long in some places, particularly around what would be the shoulders. I remember thinking it might be a bear at first, but bears don't hold branches, and they don't have arms like that. We must have made some noise because its head turned toward us. That's when I felt my whole body go cold. Its face was wrong, not entirely human, but not entirely animal either. It had a pronounced brow, a wide, somewhat flattened nose, and dark eyes that reflected the fading sunlight. When it realized we were watching it, it partially stood up. That's when I understood how massive this thing was. Even partially crouched, it was tall, way taller than my dad, who's 6 foot. Its shoulders were incredibly wide, its chest barrel-like. We all stood there, frozen in complete shock. I couldn't even breathe. Then it made a sound, a deep, rumbling growl that turned into something like a bark, but more intentional, like a warning. I've heard all kinds of animal sounds in those woods. Bears, coyotes, wildcats, but nothing like this. It was almost like it was trying to communicate. When we didn't move, honestly, I don't think any of us could have run if we wanted to. It did something that still haunts me. It threw the branch it was holding in our direction, not directly at us, but close enough to make its point. Then it let out a sound I will never forget as long as I live. Not a growl this time, but a scream, wild, primal, and incredibly loud. It echoed through the trees and seemed to vibrate in my chest. That scream broke our paralysis. It turned away from us and began moving through the woods, not running exactly, but moving with incredible speed, crashing through underbrush that would have stopped a human. I could see trees shaking as it passed them. We ran, all of us, faster than we'd ever moved before. I remember grabbing Dee's hand and practically dragging him as he struggled to keep up. Tom was in front, with Mikey right behind him, and Sammy was slightly ahead of me and Dee. No one looked back. We just ran, hearts pounding, breath burning in our lungs. We burst out of the woods and didn't stop until we reached our back porch. We piled inside, slamming the door behind us, all talking at once, trying to explain to our confused mother what we'd seen. Of course, she didn't believe us. "Probably just a bear," she said, echoing Mikey's earlier suggestion. "You boys and your imaginations." But later that night, when we were all supposed to be sleeping, We gathered in Tom and Mikey's room to talk about what we'd seen, and the strange thing was, even though we'd all been terrified and confused, our descriptions matched up. It had really long arms, Sammy said, too long for a person. And those eyes, Mikey added. They were dark but kind of shiny, smart-looking. Did you see how fast it moved? Tom whispered. Nothing moves that fast through thick woods. Nothing normal anyway. Dee was still too shaken to say much, but he nodded along with everything we said. I remember noticing how we were all whispering, like we were afraid it might somehow hear us, even though we were safe in our house. The next day, against our better judgment but driven by that strange curiosity kids have, Tom, Mikey and I went back to the spring. We didn't go alone, no way. And we didn't go far into the woods, just to the edge of the spring. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It's hard to describe. Musky, strong, like wet dog but worse, mixed with something almost skunk-like but not quite. The smell seemed to hang in the air around the spring. Then we saw the footprints. They were in the soft mud near the water's edge, where the creature must have been before we arrived the previous evening. They were huge, easily twice the size of my dad's boots, and shaped like a human foot but wider, with what looked like 5 toes. We put Tom's foot next to one for comparison, and it was no contest. Whatever made those prints was massive. We also found the branch it had thrown, a substantial piece of wood that would have been heavy for any of us to throw, but it had tossed it like it was nothing. We begged our parents to come look, but they were busy, and by the time we convinced my dad to come with us the next day, a rainstorm had washed away most of the evidence. The footprints were mostly gone, just vague depressions in the mud that my dad dismissed as probably deer tracks all mixed together. For the rest of that summer, and honestly for years afterward, we stayed closer to home. No more ventures deep into the woods, no more afternoons at the spring. Sometimes at night, especially when the windows were open, I'd hear strange calls from the direction of the woods, not quite like any animal I knew, but reminiscent of that bark-like warning we'd heard. It wasn't until years later, when I was in high school and came across a documentary about Bigfoot, that I began to understand what we might have seen. The descriptions matched: the height, the hair, the face that was almost human but not quite, the speed and strength, even the sounds it made. I called Tom, who was in college by then, and he admitted he'd been thinking the same thing for years. I've read a lot about Bigfoot sightings since then, and our experience checks so many boxes it's scary. The location makes sense: remote, wooded, near water. The behavior tracks with other accounts. The curiosity, the warning displays rather than outright aggression, the speed in the woods. Do I know for sure what we saw that day? No. But I know it wasn't a bear or a person in a suit or any known animal from those woods. And when I close my eyes at night, I can still see those dark, intelligent eyes staring at us from behind the thicket, still hear that unearthly scream echoing through the trees. I haven't been back to that spring since I moved away for work 5 years ago. My youngest brother Dee still lives in the area, and he says there have been other stories over the years. Hikers hearing strange calls, finding unexplainable footprints, sensing they're being watched. He won't go into those woods at all, not even in broad daylight with friends. Sometimes I think about going back, maybe with cameras or recording equipment. But then I remember the raw power of that creature, how it moved through dense forest like it was nothing, how it threw that heavy branch with casual ease, and I decide some mysteries are better left unexplored. Story 17. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. Part of me still thinks people will just call me crazy, but I need to get this off my chest. What my family and I experienced in Coston, British Columbia last year has completely changed how I look at the wilderness. It started last summer when we decided to take a day trip along the Similkameen River. My wife Karen, our 2 kids, Josh is 16, Emma is 12, and I packed a lunch and headed out around 10 in the morning. It was one of those perfect July days. Not too hot, clear blue sky, just beautiful. We'd been cooped up for weeks with work and summer school, and we all needed to get outside. We'd been driving with the windows down, music playing, just enjoying the scenery. Around noon, we pulled over at this scenic spot overlooking the river. It's this wide, shallow section where the water moves slowly. I remember Karen was getting the cooler from the trunk while I was helping Emma with her sunscreen. That's when Josh said, "Dad, what are those? Bears?" I looked where he was pointing, across the river about 300 meters away. At first I thought he was right, just some bears getting a drink. But something wasn't right about their size or the way they were standing. There were 4 large black shapes in the river. 2 were fully upright, standing on 2 legs, while the other 2 were hunched over like they were scooping up water. Even from that distance, I could tell they were massive. I'm a logger by trade, so I'm pretty good at estimating sizes outdoors. These things had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. "Those aren't bears," I said, grabbing the binoculars from our day pack. By the time I focused the binoculars, they'd shifted positions. The 2 that had been bent over were now standing upright too, all 4 of them, just standing there in the river. They were covered in dark hair, not black like I first thought, but a deep, dark brown. Their arms hung down to around their knees. I handed the binoculars to Karen. Her hands were shaking as she looked. "Martin, what are we looking at?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the 4 figures seemed to notice us. They didn't make any sudden movements, but all 4 heads turned in our direction simultaneously. I felt this cold sensation run down my spine. "Get in the car," I said, trying to keep my voice steady for the kids. We piled in, and I started driving, looking for a way to get closer, not because I wanted to approach them, but because I needed to confirm what we'd seen. We drove down several access roads, but none seemed to lead to that specific bend in the river. After about 20 minutes of searching, we gave up and returned to our original spot. They were gone. The river was empty. We tried to enjoy the rest of our day, but it was impossible. The kids kept asking what we saw, and I didn't have answers. Karen suggested maybe they were people in wetsuits, but that made no sense. Who wears dark wetsuits to stand in a shallow river on a summer day? And it didn't explain their size. On the drive home, we agreed not to mention it to anyone. Who would believe us? 4 giant hairy things standing in a river. We'd sound insane, but it stayed with us. Josh started researching online, watching videos about Sasquatch sightings in British Columbia. I didn't encourage it, but I didn't stop him either. For months, nothing else happened. Life went back to normal, and we almost convinced ourselves we'd seen something explainable. Moose or elk from a weird angle, maybe. Almost. Then came January 2nd. It was unusually warm for January, barely below freezing, with just a light dusting of snow on the ground. I had the week off work, and we decided to take a drive out near Karameas and the Ashnola area. It's beautiful country out there, mountains, forests, very few people. We packed some hot chocolate in thermoses and headed out around 2 in the afternoon. We'd been driving for about an hour when we pulled over at this overlook. The kids wanted to take pictures of the valley below. I remember checking my watch. It was just past 3, and we still had a couple hours of daylight left. That's when we heard it. It started as this low rumble that I thought was a truck engine somewhere nearby. But then it changed, rising into this deep, powerful howl that sent vibrations through my chest. It was coming from the forest about half a kilometer away. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I've heard wolves, cougars, bears, elk. This wasn't any of those. It was too loud, too deep, too intelligent sounding. Josh went white as a sheet. "Dad," he whispered, "that sounds exactly like those Sasquatch recordings I showed you." He was right. I'd humored him by listening to some supposed Sasquatch calls online, but I'd dismissed them as fakes. This was different. This was real. and it was happening right in front of us. The howl lasted for almost 30 seconds, echoing off the mountains. When it stopped, there was this unnatural silence. No birds, no wind, nothing. I don't know what came over me, but I started walking toward the tree line. Karen hissed at me to get back in the truck, but I felt like I needed to see something, anything, to make sense of what we were hearing. I'd gone maybe 20 steps when someone, probably Emma, hit the horn on our truck. It was just a quick beep, but the sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. The howling stopped instantly, not like it faded away, but like someone had flipped a switch. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing. I hurried back to the truck, and we sat there for a few minutes just listening. Nothing. Finally, Karen said we should leave, and I didn't argue. As we drove back toward the main road, I took a turn down this side road I'd never been on before. I can't explain why. Curiosity, I guess, or maybe something more instinctual. We followed it for about half a mile until it dead-ended at an old logging area. That's where we saw the tracks. They crossed the road in a straight line, heading from one side of the forest to the other. At first, I thought they were from someone wearing snowshoes, but as I got closer, I realized they were individual footprints, enormous footprints in the thin layer of snow. I got out to look, telling the family to stay in the truck. Each print was around 20 inches long and at least 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The stride length between them was incredible, easily 5 feet or more. They weren't fresh, maybe a day old based on the slight melting around the edges, but they were unmistakable. Human feet don't look like that. They had 5 toes, a deep arch, and a wide ball, and they were deeper than they should have been, like whatever made them weighed several hundred pounds. I took pictures with my phone, trying to get something with scale by putting my own boot next to one print. My size 12 looked like a child's footprint beside it. As I was taking photos, I felt watched. The forest was dead silent, but I could feel eyes on me. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something's off, and everything about this situation was wrong. "Martin, please get back in the truck," Karen called, her voice tight with fear. I looked up at the tree line about 50 yards away. For just a second, and I've questioned this moment 1,000 times since, I thought I saw movement, something large and dark, shifting behind a cluster of pines. Then it was gone. I practically ran back to the truck and we got out of there fast. The kids were quiet the whole way home, which never happens. When we got back, I downloaded the photos from my phone, but they didn't capture the scale or the feeling of standing there. They just looked like odd depressions in dirty snow. That night, after the kids went to bed, Karen and I talked about what to do. We agreed not to mention it to anyone. Who would believe us? I considered reporting it to a wildlife agency, but what would I say? I saw giant footprints and heard a weird howl. It's been 6 months now, and we haven't gone back to that area. Josh is still obsessed, constantly showing me websites about Sasquatch sightings in British Columbia. There are more than you'd think. Sometimes I wake up at night hearing that howl in my dreams. Karen says I've called out in my sleep a few times. I don't know what we saw in the river that day, or what made those tracks, or what created that bone-shaking howl. But I know it wasn't normal wildlife. I've lived here my entire life, and I've never experienced anything like it. I still have the photos on my computer, though they don't show much. I sometimes think about sending them to one of those cryptozoology websites, but then I imagine the ridicule, the questions, the people showing up to search the area. So I keep quiet. But I know what I saw, and I know that something is out there in the forests of British Columbia, something large, something intelligent, and something that doesn't want to be found. I just hope I never find it again.